Picture this. A man stands in a darkened chamber, the air thick with the scent of rare oils and burning incense. He is not a warrior, fresh from a bloody battlefield, and he is not a politician who has outmaneuvered his rivals in a public debate. He is a priest, a figure already cloaked in reverence, but today something extraordinary is about to happen. Through a series of meticulously choreographed words, gestures, and symbolic acts, he will be remade. By the time the ceremony concludes, he will no longer be just a man who speaks for the gods. He will be seen as a god himself, a living king whose very breath is considered an extension of divine will. This was the ultimate transformation, the secret alchemy of early power, and it had very little to do with brute force and everything to do with the masterful theater of faith. Welcome to a journey where we decode the hidden rituals that turned priests into kings and forged history's first empires, not just with armies, but with awe. This video, From Priest to King, Decoding the Power Rituals of Early Imperial Ascension, is your guide to unraveling the secret scripts of authority. We are going to pull back the curtain on a time when spiritual legitimacy was the ultimate political currency, more valuable than any treasury of gold or silver. You will discover the intricate rites and potent symbols from sacred anointing oils that were believed to infuse a mortal with divine spirit, to carefully fabricated prophecies that placed a ruler's ascent in the stars, that were used to manufacture consent and command absolute loyalty from entire populations. This was the original playbook for power, a psychological and sociological toolkit designed to convince people that their leader was not merely a person, but a pivotal part of the cosmic order. It was a brilliant, enduring strategy that made obedience feel like piety and questioning authority feel like blasphemy. Our exploration will carry us from the sun-baked temples of ancient Egypt, where pharaohs performed the part of living gods, to the bustling forums of Rome, where emperors skillfully blended the roles of chief priest and supreme commander. We will uncover the fascinating mechanisms behind these ancient power plays, revealing how they were not mere superstition, but sophisticated systems of control and cohesion. And here is the most compelling part. This exploration is not just an academic look at the distant past. The blueprints of leadership and persuasion that we will uncover are enduring. They reveal the foundational principles of how authority is built, legitimized, and maintained, principles that still subtly influence the structures of power and the theater of politics in our world today. Prepare to see history's greatest rulers in a completely new light, because we are about to decode the incredible rituals that forged entire empires from the raw material of faith. To truly grasp the monumental shift from priest to king, we have to travel back to a time before sprawling empires and standing armies, to the very roots of human community. Picture a small, vulnerable settlement in a vast, unpredictable world. The rains might not come, a disease could sweep through, or a rival group might attack. In this environment of constant uncertainty, the most valuable person wasn't necessarily the strongest warrior, but the one who could allegedly negotiate with the invisible forces controlling fate. This was the shaman or the tribal seer, the individual who entered trance states, interpreted dreams, and performed rituals to appease the spirits of the hunt, the harvest, and the ancestors. Their authority came from a perceived ability to influence the uncontrollable, to bring order to chaos through a sacred connection. Now, imagine a community growing larger, becoming a town, then a city. The role of the protector and the role of the spiritual intermediary begin to merge in a single, powerful individual. The chieftain who leads in battle realizes that his power is magnified 1,000-fold if his commands are seen not as his own, but as the will of the gods themselves. This fusion is the birth of the priest king, a hybrid figure who becomes the indispensable bridge between the human and the divine, the one person who could read the celestial signs and translate them into earthly law. This archetype found one of its earliest and most clear expressions in the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia. In the city-states of Sumer, the ruler was known as the Ensi. This was not just a political title, it was a sacred office. The Ensi was the governor of the city, responsible for its administration, its justice, and its defense. But simultaneously, he held the title of High Priest of the city's patron deity. Whether it was Enki in Eridu or Inanna in Yurok, the Ensi was the chief servant of the god, managing the temple's vast estates and leading the most important public ceremonies. This duality was absolutely brilliant in its design. It meant that when the Ensi decreed a new tax or called men to arms, he wasn't just giving an order as a man. He was acting as the voice of the god who owned the city and everything in it. There was no separation between church and state because the state was the earthly household of the god, and the king was its divinely appointed steward. His political power was sanctified, and his religious role was politicized, creating a feedback loop of authority that was incredibly difficult to challenge. This foundational model created a profound and enduring sense of stability. A king who gained power through conquest could be overthrown by a better warrior. A king who was elected by a council could be voted out, but a king whose right to rule was woven into the very fabric of the cosmos. His authority was presented as eternal, a fundamental part of the natural order. To rebel against such a ruler was not just a political miscalculation, it was an act of impiety that risked bringing the wrath of the gods down upon the entire community. A poor harvest or a lost battle could be interpreted as divine punishment for the people's disloyalty, not the king's failure. This is the deepest, most ancient root of the concept of divine right that would echo through the centuries in places like medieval Europe. It's a political strategy that outsources the enforcement of power to the supernatural realm. The threat isn't just the king's army, but the possibility of cosmic chaos if his sacred position is undermined. This psychological lever is what made the priest-king archetype so powerful and so resilient. It transformed the burden of obedience from a practical necessity into a spiritual duty. Understanding this primordial blueprint is absolutely essential because it sets the stage for everything that follows. The priest-king was the core concept, but this claimed divine connection was an abstract idea. It had to be made visible, tangible, and unforgettable to the population. You couldn't just say you were the chosen of the gods. You had to perform it, ritualize it, and embed it into the very rhythm of daily life. The complex coronations, the sacred marriages, the control of calendars, all these elaborate rituals we will explore were not random inventions. They were the necessary, logical extensions of this original archetype. They were the public relations campaigns and the psychological operations of the ancient world, designed to prove and continually reaffirm the ruler's unique status. They turned the abstract claim of a divine mandate into a spectacular, repeatable reality that everyone could see and participate in. So as we move forward to decode these specific rituals, keep this foundational image in mind: the figure who stands at the intersection of heaven and earth, for whom the political and the spiritual are not two separate realms, but a single, unified source of absolute power. Now we arrive at the moment of metamorphosis, the first great ritual of ascension, the sacred anointing and coronation. Picture the scene in the innermost sanctum of an Egyptian temple. The air is thick with the smoke of rare incense, and the new pharaoh stands before the high priests. This is not a celebration, it is a profound spiritual operation. The central act is the anointing, the application of holy oils to the ruler's body. But this was far from a simple symbolic gesture. In Egypt, the pharaoh was anointed with not one, but 7 distinct sacred oils, each one meticulously prepared in temple laboratories by priests who followed ancient secret recipes. These weren't just any oils, they were considered the very sweat of the gods, each variety channeling the power and essence of a specific deity. One oil, associated with the god Horus, might confer the sharp sight and authority of the falcon god. Another, linked to Thoth, was believed to bestow divine wisdom and eloquence. A third, connected to Seth, could impart the brutal strength necessary to crush the enemies of order. This was a targeted spiritual infusion, a process of layering different aspects of divinity onto a single mortal frame. The significance of this ritual cannot be overstated. It was understood as a literal metaphysical transformation, a rebirth of the individual into the divine office of kingship. The man who entered the temple was a son of his father. The man who left was the living son of the sun god Ra, a god incarnate walking the earth. The oil was the medium of this change, the sacred substance that conducted the divine spirit from the realm of the gods into the body of the king. This concept resonates powerfully beyond the Nile Valley. In the Hebrew tradition, the act of anointing a king, as performed for Saul and David, was what set them apart as Yahweh's anointed, or Meshiach, the root of the word Messiah. This anointing marked them with an indelible spiritual seal. It placed them under divine protection, but it also made them accountable directly to God. To raise a hand against the Lord's anointed was to challenge God himself. This shared symbolism across vastly different cultures points to a universal understanding that a special substance could act as a conduit for a supernatural transfer of power and identity. Following the anointing came the coronation proper, the moment of crowning. We must discard our modern image of a crown as a lightweight, decorative piece of regalia. In the ancient world, a crown was a heavy, potent object, both physically and symbolically. In Egypt, the double crown of Pi-Shent, combining the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, was not merely a representation of a unified kingdom. It was the very embodiment of that unity, a magical object that made the political reality manifest. The weight of the crown on the pharaoh's head was the weight of the entire cosmic order, the responsibility to maintain math, truth, justice, and balance against the ever-lurking forces of chaos. Similarly, in other cultures, crowns were often depicted as radiating light, mimicking the sun, directly associating the ruler with the most powerful celestial body. The act of placing the crown was the final, irrevocable step. It locked the divine spirit, infused by the anointing oils, into place. It completed the circuit. The man was gone, and the monarch now stood in his place. This entire sequence, the anointing and the coronation, was a masterclass in political theater with a deep psychological purpose. It created a single, unforgettable, and visually spectacular moment that everyone could point to as the instant their leader was transformed. It made an abstract spiritual claim into a tangible, sensory experience. The smell of the oils, the sight of the glittering crown, the sound of the ritual chants, all of it was designed to overwhelm the senses and cement the new reality in the minds of the witnesses. It was a public and physical marking of the chosen one, creating a clear before and after in the life of the ruler and the history of the nation. This ritual answered a fundamental human need for a visible sign of legitimacy. It was not enough to simply declare that the king had a special relationship with the gods. That relationship had to be performed, witnessed, and made real through a powerful, shared ceremony. The profound success of this ritual, however, relied on a pre-existing foundation. A transformation this grand required a compelling backstory, a reason why this particular individual was worthy of such an honor. The anointing provided the how, but it was the next set of rituals that provided the crucial why. So if the sacred anointing provided the dramatic, public moment of transformation, the next ritual provided the backstory, the origin myth that made the entire transformation believable in the first place. A king anointed by the gods is one thing, but a king who is literally a descendant of the gods, that is an entirely different level of legitimacy. This is where we encounter the second masterful ritual of Ascension, the fabrication of divine genealogy and prophecy. This was the ancient world's equivalent of a public relations campaign, designed to create an unassailable backstory that rooted a ruler's power not in recent political maneuvering, but in the timeless realm of myth and divine will. It was about crafting a narrative so compelling that it made the ruler's authority seem inevitable, a foregone conclusion written in the stars and in his very blood. Consider the case of Alexander the Great, a master of this particular art form. Alexander operated in a highly competitive Macedonian court where powerful noble families were constantly jostling for influence. To rise above this fray and justify his incredible ambitions, he needed a pedigree that none of his rivals could match. So, his court historians and propagandists got to work. On his father's side, they traced his lineage back to the legendary hero Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Trojan War, linking Alexander to an immortal legacy of martial prowess and heroic glory. But that was just the warm-up act. The truly audacious claim came from his mother, Olympias. The story was spread that she had been visited by the god Zeus Ammon, not in a dream but in a physical manifestation, often said to be in the form of a serpent, and that Alexander was the product of this divine union. This wasn't just a quiet family legend, it was a central tenet of his public image. When he journeyed to the remote oracle of Siwa in Egypt, the priests there conveniently confirmed his divine sonship. This celestial pedigree served a direct political purpose. It placed him categorically above the other Macedonian nobles. They were merely aristocrats, he was a demigod. How could they possibly challenge the son of Zeus himself? His divine bloodline became the ultimate argument for his right to conquer the known world. But it wasn't just about bloodlines, it was also about destiny, and this is where prophecies and oracles became powerful political instruments. The Romans were particularly adept at this. The Sibylline books were a collection of ancient, cryptic prophecies kept under lock and key by a special college of priests, and were only to be consulted at the command of the Senate in times of grave crisis. Augustus, Rome's first emperor, understood the immense authority these texts held. He didn't ignore them, he co-opted them. He actively used the Sibylline books to legitimize his reign, promoting the idea that his rise to power and the ensuing era of peace, the Pax Augusta, had been foretold centuries earlier. He fostered a narrative that his rule was not a disruption of the Roman Republic, but the fulfillment of a divine plan, a destined golden age that the gods had always intended. And to add a personal, miraculous touch to this narrative, there was the story of his own conception. The tale went that his mother, Asia, had been visited by the god Apollo in the form of a serpent, and from this union Augustus was conceived. This was a masterclass in myth-making, creating a direct, personal connection to a major deity that perfectly complemented the state-sanctioned prophecies. These carefully constructed narratives, however, would have been useless if they remained confined to scrolls in a library. The genius of these rulers was in their mastery of mass communication. They turned the very fabric of daily life into a medium for their divine stories, coins which passed through the hands of every citizen, merchant, and soldier, were minted with images of the ruler's divine patron or symbols of his heroic lineage. Public art statues, reliefs on temples, grand altars visually reinforced the message. Literature and poetry, often sponsored directly by the court, wove these myths into the cultural consciousness. This multi-pronged approach ensured that the official story of the ruler's divine right was inescapable. It was on the money you used to buy bread, carved into the walls of the temples you visited, and recited in the poems you heard. This constant, low-grade reinforcement made the divine narrative feel less like propaganda and more like simple, accepted fact. The ultimate goal of this ritual was profound. By embedding themselves within a pre-existing sacred history, whether it was the heroic age of Greek myth or the prophetic traditions of Rome, these rulers performed a brilliant sleight of hand. They reframed their often violent and ambitious ascension to power. It was no longer a raw seizure of control born of ambition or military success. Instead, it was presented as the fulfillment of a divine plan, the inevitable unfolding of a destiny laid out by the gods long before they were even born. Their personal ambition was laundered through the sacred, emerging as pious duty. Their political power was transformed into a cosmic necessity. With this celestial bloodline and divinely sanctioned destiny now firmly established in the minds of their people, the stage was set. The ruler, now seen as a figure of mythic origins, had to step into his role and perform it in the most sacred spaces, acting out a relationship with the divine that went beyond ancestry and into the realm of symbolic marriage. With a celestial bloodline and a destiny written in the stars, the newly anointed ruler now faced a critical task, making his connection to the divine power that sustained his people tangible and active. This brings us to one of the most intimate and potent rituals of all, the symbolic marriage to the land and its deities. Think about the fundamental anxieties of an ancient agricultural society. Will the rains come? Will the soil be fertile? Will the harvest be abundant enough to see us through the year? The ruler's legitimacy hinged on his perceived ability to guarantee these basic necessities. He couldn't control the weather, but through a brilliant piece of political theater, he could present himself as the key figure in a sacred relationship that ensured nature's continued bounty. This was the purpose of the hieros gamos, or sacred marriage, a ritual that transformed the abstract responsibility of kingship into a deeply personal, procreative bond between the ruler and the very earth he governed. The practice found one of its most explicit expressions in the city-states of ancient Mesopotamia. Each year, the king would participate in a profound ceremony with the high priestess of Inanna, the powerful goddess of love, fertility, and war. This was not a metaphorical gesture. It involved a ritual act of consummation within the sacred precincts of the temple. The significance was immense and direct. By uniting with the human representative of the goddess, the king was believed to be marrying Inanna herself. This divine union was seen as the spiritual engine that drove the fertility of the entire kingdom. His physical act was thought to magically stimulate the land's productivity, ensuring that crops would grow, animals would reproduce, and the people would prosper. A successful harvest wasn't just good luck. It was proof that the king had successfully performed his sacred duty and maintained the favor of the gods. A failed harvest, conversely, could be interpreted as a failure in this divine relationship, potentially threatening the king's mandate to rule. This ritual created a direct causal link between the ruler's body and the body of the land, making the health of one synonymous with the health of the other. This concept of a symbolic marriage was expressed differently, yet just as powerfully, along the Nile. The Egyptian pharaoh was enmeshed in a complex web of divine familial relationships that served a similar purpose. He was considered the husband of the goddess Hathor, a deity embodying joy, music, love, and crucially nourishment. As the consort of Hathor, the pharaoh was positioned as the active partner who received and channeled her life-giving energy to the people of Egypt. Simultaneously, he was the revered son of the goddess Isis, the ultimate symbol of devoted motherhood and magical protection. This dual identity was genius. As the husband of Hathor, he was the provider. As the son of Isis, he was the protected and legitimate heir. These relationships intertwined his identity with the core principles of the divine feminine: nourishment, sovereignty, and cyclical renewal. His rule was not just administrative, it was a sacred, familial duty within the cosmic household of the gods. The psychological and political impact of this ritual cannot be overstated. It masterfully reframed the entire concept of governance. Ruling a country is a cold, distant abstraction, but being a husband to the land or a son of a protective mother goddess. These are roles steeped in deep, universally understood emotions and obligations. This metaphor transformed the relationship between the king and his subjects into something akin to a family bond. The king was no longer a distant tax collector or a warlord. He was the patriarch, the provider, the one obligated to protect and care for his spouse, the nation, and his children, the people. This framed his power not as a right to exploit, but as a sacred duty to nurture. It created a powerful emotional contract. The people owed him loyalty and obedience, but in return, he was bound by a sacred vow to ensure their fertility, safety, and prosperity. It made good governance a matter of religious fidelity. This profound, intimate connection with the divine feminine, established through the ritual of sacred marriage, naturally paved the way for the next logical step in the consolidation of power. If the king was the husband of goddesses and the son of divine mothers, who better to serve as the ultimate intermediary between the people and the entire pantheon? This intimate, privileged relationship became the perfect justification for him to assume the highest religious office in the land, formally merging the role of king with the role of supreme high priest and taking direct, unassailable control over the state's entire spiritual apparatus. This intimate, symbolic marriage to the land and its deities created a powerful bond, but it was a bond that required constant maintenance and public demonstration. To truly secure this connection, the ruler had to become the undisputed master of the channels through which humanity communicated with the divine. This brings us to the fourth critical ritual of Ascension, the formal assumption of the high priesthood. This was the moment a king didn't just claim a special relationship with the gods. He seized the institutional levers of that relationship, placing himself at the very head of the state's religious machinery. In Rome, this pivotal role was encapsulated in the ancient and powerful title of Pontifex Maximus, which translates to greatest bridge builder. This was not a casual honorific, it was a job description. The Pontifex Maximus was the chief priest, the ultimate authority on all matters of ritual, doctrine, and religious law. He presided over the College of Pontiffs, the most influential priests in the Republic, and had final say over the complex, unwritten body of traditions that governed Rome's relationship with its gods. The first emperor, Augustus, understood the profound political power inherent in this religious office better than anyone. He was a master of appearing to restore tradition while fundamentally reshaping the Roman state to center on himself. In the year 12 BCE, upon the death of the previous holder, Augustus did not seize the title by force. Instead, he was elected by the College of Priests, a move that carefully preserved the facade of republican procedure. But from that moment forward, the title of Pontifex Maximus became a permanent fixture of the imperial office, a core component of every emperor's identity. Augustus then used this authority with breathtaking effectiveness. He embarked on a massive program of religious restoration, rebuilding or refurbishing dozens of aging temples across the city. On the surface, this was a deeply conservative act, a return to the piety of the ancestors. In reality, it was a brilliant political strategy. By restoring the physical houses of the gods, he positioned himself as the guardian of Roman tradition and morality. He used his power as chief priest to pass laws promoting marriage and childbearing, aligning public virtue with his own political vision for a stable, populous empire. He controlled the religious calendar, deciding which festivals were celebrated and how, ensuring that the rhythm of public life consistently reinforced the values and the narrative he wanted to promote. The scope of this control was absolute and touched every aspect of Roman spiritual life. The emperor, as Pontifex Maximus, held the keys to interpreting the will of the gods themselves. When priests known as augurs studied the flight patterns of birds to seek divine approval for a state action, it was the emperor's authority that gave their interpretations weight. When haruspices examined the entrails of sacrificed animals for omens, their findings were reported to the imperial court. This gave the emperor an almost limitless ability to justify his decisions. A military campaign could be launched because the omens were favorable. A political rival could be sidelined because the gods had supposedly shown disfavor. This system created a perfect, self-justifying loop. The state, led by the emperor, would take an action, and the state religion, also led by the emperor, would then discover the divine confirmation for that very action. It made opposition not just politically dangerous, but spiritually suspect. To disagree with the emperor was, in a very real sense, to disagree with the gods he represented and interpreted. This fusion of supreme political and religious authority was by no means unique to Rome. On the other side of the world, in the mighty Inca Empire, the ruler, known as the Sapa Inca, embodied the same principle. He was the absolute political leader, but he was also something more, the head priest of the sun god Inti. The Inca state was essentially a theocracy, and the Sapa Inca's primary responsibility was to maintain the relationship between the people and the pantheon of gods that controlled nature. He didn't just delegate the most important ceremonies, he led them personally. During the festival of Inti Raymi, the grand celebration of the sun god, the Sapa Inca would preside over the rituals, offering sacrifices and prayers to ensure the sun's return and the fertility of the land. His person was considered sacred, a direct descendant of the sun, and his role as high priest was not an add-on to his power, it was the very source of it. In this system, the line between faith and state simply did not exist. A challenge to the Sapa Inca's religious authority was an act of treason against the state, and conversely, political loyalty was a fundamental religious obligation for every subject. This ritual of assuming the high priesthood was therefore the ultimate act of nationalizing faith. It took the diverse, personal, and potentially unpredictable realm of spiritual belief and brought it firmly under the control of the central government. It transformed religion from a personal matter of conscience into a public duty of citizenship. The state and its official religion became one and the same entity, with the ruler serving as its living, breathing CEO and head theologian. This consolidation of power was incredibly effective for maintaining control, but it also created a system with zero tolerance for dissent. It eliminated any competing source of spiritual authority that could challenge the ruler's monopoly on truth. By making himself the chief priest, the king or emperor didn't just rule the bodies of his subjects, he laid claim to their souls, ensuring that the path to divine favor ran directly through his office. And this control over the sacred calendar and public ritual gave him an unparalleled tool for shaping reality, a power that naturally extended to the mysterious art of discerning the future, of interpreting the subtle signs and omens that were believed to guide the fate of nations. While the emperor's role as chief priest gave him control over public ceremonies and the sacred calendar, his authority reached its most potent form in the deeply mysterious art of divination. This was the ultimate political superpower, the exclusive right to ask the gods for their opinion and, more importantly, to be the sole interpreter of their cryptic replies. Imagine a ruler facing a critical decision. Should he go to war, appoint a certain official, or begin a massive building project? In our modern world, a leader might consult advisors, economists, or intelligence reports. But in the ancient world, the most trusted intelligence came from the divine realm, and the emperor held the only clear channel to it. This was not about blind superstition. It was a sophisticated system for managing uncertainty and legitimizing state power. By mastering the reading of omens, a ruler could present his every decision not as a fallible human choice, but as the direct implementation of a divine plan, making dissent seem not only foolish but dangerously blasphemous. One of the most ancient and systematic forms of this practice flourished in China under the Zhou dynasty and the emperors who followed. Their method was known as scapulimancy, a complex ritual that involved the careful heating of animal bones, most often the shoulder bones of oxen or the plastrons of tortoise shells. Specialists would carve questions into the bone, questions like, "Will the harvest be bountiful this season?" Or, "If we launch a military campaign to the north, will we be victorious?" Then they applied intense heat to the bone with a hot metal rod. The stress would cause the bone to crack, and the pattern of these cracks was believed to be the written response of the ancestors and the gods. Priests, who were high-ranking state officials, would then read these fissures, interpreting their length, direction, and intersections to deliver a yes or no answer from the cosmos. The brilliance of this system was its exclusivity, the right to perform these rites and, crucially, to provide their final interpretation was a cornerstone of the mandate of heaven. This mandate was the philosophical foundation of Chinese imperial rule, the idea that heaven bestowed the right to rule on a just and virtuous dynasty. A successful reading confirmed the emperor's virtue and the continued favor of heaven. A failed campaign or a natural disaster, however, could be interpreted as a crack in the mandate itself, a sign that heaven was withdrawing its support and that rebellion might be justified. The emperor's control over divination was therefore a matter of existential political security. On the other side of the world, the Romans were conducting their own elaborate conversations with the gods through a rich vocabulary of natural signs. The Roman state religion had two primary groups of diviners, the augurs and the haruspices. The augurs were official priests whose duty was to take the auspices to observe the signs or auspicia sent by Jupiter through the flight of birds. Before any major public undertaking, an augur would designate a sacred space in the sky, a templum, and then carefully watch the birds within it. The types of birds, their direction of flight, their calls, and even their interactions with each other were all packed with meaning. Did an eagle, Jupiter's own bird, fly from left to right? That was an excellent omen, signaling divine approval. Did a flock of smaller birds scatter in panic? That could be a dire warning. Meanwhile, the haruspices, a separate class of priests often drawn from Etruscan tradition, practiced extispicy, the examination of the entrails of sacrificed animals. They would look at the liver, lungs, and heart of a ritually slaughtered sheep, searching for any anomalies, discolorations, unusual lobes, or marks. The liver was considered a particular mirror of the divine will, a microcosm of the cosmos itself. A healthy, well-formed liver meant the gods were pleased. A misshapen or blemished one could bring all state business to a halt. This system, however, was far from a neutral scientific inquiry. It was a political tool of immense flexibility in the hands of a skilled ruler. The first emperor, Augustus, was a master of this art. He understood that the real power lay not in the observation of the omen itself, but in its public interpretation and promotion. A famous example occurred just after the assassination of his adoptive father, Julius Caesar. In the year 44 BCE, a brilliant comet appeared in the sky during public games held in Caesar's honor. For most people, a comet was a terrifying and unpredictable portent, often seen as a sign of impending doom or the death of a king. But Augustus seized the narrative. He declared that this was no ordinary comet. It was the soul of the deified Julius Caesar ascending to take his place among the gods of Olympus. This was a breathtaking act of political and theological genius. He transformed a potential symbol of chaos and misfortune into a powerful, validating myth. It provided divine sanction for his own position as the son of a god, and it gave the Roman people a new celestial patron. This was divination as public relations, turning a random celestial event into a cornerstone of imperial propaganda. This control over divine messaging created a perfect, self-justifying feedback loop for the state. The emperor and his priests would propose a course of action, for instance, building a new aqueduct or declaring war on a neighboring tribe. Then they would perform the necessary rites to consult the gods. Unsurprisingly, the omens almost always confirmed that the gods were in full agreement with the emperor's pre-existing plans. A favorable flight of birds or a healthy-looking sheep liver would be discovered, providing the celestial green light. This loop made state action appear preordained and blessed. For a senator or a general to oppose such a plan was no longer simply a political disagreement. It was to set one's own flawed human judgment against the confirmed will of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. It framed opposition as impiety, a dangerous defiance of the cosmic order. In this system, the emperor didn't just rule by decree, he ruled by divine revelation. He held the only key to understanding the cosmic plan, and he could use that key to unlock whatever political outcome he desired. This claimed connection to the celestial realm, so powerfully demonstrated through rituals and interpreted signs, demanded a permanent physical testament. It was not enough to simply read the will of the gods. That will had to be set in stone, literally and magnificently, for all to see. This control over the divine will, so carefully interpreted through rituals of divination, demanded a permanent and awe-inspiring home. The omens and prophecies were powerful, but they were fleeting. A ruler's legacy needed to be carved not just in the air with whispered interpretations, but into the very bedrock of the earth, in structures so colossal and magnificent that they would dominate the skyline for centuries. This brings us to the sixth profound ritual of Ascension, the construction of sacred space and monumental architecture. Here, kings and emperors moved beyond performance and narrative to engage in the ultimate act of world building. They became the master architects of reality, physically reshaping their domains to serve as a permanent, three-dimensional manifesto of their divine right to rule. This was power made visible, power made solid, power that you could walk through, touch, and feel dwarfed by. Consider the staggering scale of the temple complex at Karnak in ancient Egypt. This was not a single building but a vast city of stone, a project that spanned nearly 2,000 years of pharaonic rule. Each successive pharaoh felt compelled to add his own chapel, pylon gateway, or towering obelisk, not merely as an act of vanity, but as a fundamental duty of his office. Walking through the great hypostyle hall, a visitor would be utterly overwhelmed by a forest of 134 massive columns, each one soaring nearly 70 feet into the air. so thick that it would take 5 people with outstretched arms to encircle one. The ceiling, now mostly gone, was once painted a deep blue with golden stars, representing the very firmament of the heavens, and on every surface, every column, every wall, every inch of these monumental structures were deeply carved reliefs. These were not generic religious scenes. They depicted one specific, repeated narrative, the pharaoh, always shown on a superhuman scale, in direct physical communion with the gods. You would see Amun-Ra, the king of the gods, placing the crown on the pharaoh's head, or the pharaoh presenting offerings that were taller than he was. The message was inescapable and reinforced with every single step. This space was not built for human comfort. It was built for human subjugation, to make you feel tiny, and to make the pharaoh's connection to the cosmos feel as solid and eternal as the stone surrounding you. The temple was a machine for producing awe, and its primary product was loyalty. A similar, though distinctly political, vision was carved into the mountainside at Persepolis in Persia. Darius I and his successors did not build a temple to a single god, but a magnificent palace complex designed as the administrative and ceremonial heart of a vast multicultural empire. The genius of Persepolis lies in its architectural storytelling. The approach to the audience hall, the Apadana, was via 2 grand, symmetrical stairways. And lining these stairways are row upon row of breathtakingly detailed reliefs. They do not show scenes of battle or conquest. Instead, they depict a serene, orderly procession. Here are delegates from all 23 satrapies or provinces of the Persian Empire. You can see Medes bringing finely woven textiles, Ethiopians presenting ivory tusks, Babylonians leading bulls, and Assyrians with model chariots. Each group is shown in their distinct national dress, but all are moving harmoniously together, climbing the stairs to present their tribute to the King of Kings. This was a visual metaphor for the entire imperial project. It presented the empire not as a collection of conquered peoples held by force, but as a voluntary, peaceful, and divinely ordained union of nations, all gratefully offering their wealth to a benevolent universal monarch. The architecture itself became a declaration of ideology, stating that the king's power brought order, unity, and prosperity to the entire known world. The crucial element that made this more than just extravagant building was the framing. The very act of construction was itself ritualized and presented as a sacred obligation. Inscriptions from across the ancient world, from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, consistently describe a ruler's building projects not as personal monuments, but as pious acts of service. A king would be commanded in a dream by a god to rebuild a crumbling temple. He would be described as the one who lays the foundations for the god, or who makes the god's house shine like the sun. This was brilliant political theology. It transformed the back-breaking, resource-draining labor of thousands of workers from a tyrannical demand into a collective religious duty. The taxes and corvée labor required to build these monuments were not seen as an oppressive burden, but as a shared participation in a sacred project that pleased the gods and ensured the stability of the universe. The king was merely the instrument, the divinely appointed foreman for a celestial construction project. This framing made the incredible economic cost socially acceptable, even honorable. By controlling sacred geography in this way, a ruler did something profoundly powerful. He embedded his authority directly into the landscape of daily life. The average person might never see the emperor in person, and they might only hear second-hand accounts of his coronation or his interpretations of omens. But they could see his temple on the hill every single day. They would go about their lives in the shadow of the walls he had built, pass through the city gates he had commissioned, and draw water from the aqueducts he had funded. His name was carved into the foundation stones of the bridges they crossed. This constant physical presence made the abstract concept of kingship a tangible, inescapable reality. The ruler's power was no longer just an idea or a temporary performance. It was baked into the environment, as permanent and unquestionable as the mountains and the rivers. It created a world where the king's legitimacy was the backdrop against which all of life unfolded. These stone testaments, however, were only one half of the equation. For all their permanence, they were static. To truly captivate a population, the power they represented needed to be brought to life, to be set in motion in a spectacular, emotional, and shared public experience. While the grand temples and palaces stood as permanent monuments to a ruler's power, there was another kind of ritual that brought that authority to life in the most dynamic and unforgettable way imaginable. This was the triumph, the grand public spectacle, a breathtaking performance where the entire city became a stage and every citizen an extra in a drama designed to showcase the emperor's divine favor and military genius. In Rome, the triumph was the highest honor a general could aspire to, a ritual so meticulously choreographed that it transformed a mortal man into a living god for a single, glorious day. The streets would be packed, the air buzzing with anticipation, as the procession began its slow, majestic march along a sacred route through the heart of the city. At its head was the triumphator himself, but he was unrecognizable in his divine costume. He wore the full, magnificent regalia of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the king of the gods, a tunic embroidered with palm leaves, a lavish purple toga, and a laurel wreath held above his head. Most strikingly, his face was painted with red vermilion, the same sacred pigment used on the statue of Jupiter in his great temple. This was not a man celebrating a victory. This was a god-king manifesting in the mortal realm, a walking, breathing embodiment of Rome's invincible spirit. The procession itself was a rolling narrative of conquest and abundance. It was a tangible inventory of the benefits of imperial rule. First came the spoils of war, carried on wagons or displayed on floats, chests overflowing with gold and silver coins, glittering piles of captured armor and weapons, and intricate works of art plundered from foreign temples. Then came the captives, a somber and humiliated train of the defeated. Enemy kings and chieftains who days before had commanded armies, now shuffled in chains, dressed in their ruined finery, a living testament to the futility of opposing Rome's might. For the Roman populace, this was more than just a show. It was proof. It was visceral evidence that their emperor was successfully fulfilling his most basic duty, expanding the empire's wealth and securing its borders. The sight of so much treasure and so many defeated enemies created an intoxicating mix of national pride, personal greed, and profound relief. It made the abstract concept of imperial power something you could see, touch, and almost taste. Yet, woven into this pageant of supreme exaltation was a thread of profound, almost paradoxical caution. Riding in the triumphal chariot, standing directly behind the godlike general, was a public slave. This man held a golden crown over the triumphator's head, but his most important duty was to continuously whisper a reminder into the general's ear. The words were a stark counterpoint to the roaring crowds, respice post te. Hominum te memento, look behind you, remember you are a man. This was a masterstroke of psychological and political theater. It served as a powerful check on the ambition of the general, a humbling reminder that his godhood was temporary and conditional. But for the state and the watching Senate, it also sent a crucial message to the people. Yes, we celebrate our heroes, but we never let them forget their mortal station. No single man, no matter how victorious, was above the Republic and later the Empire itself. This delicate balance between exaltation and humility was what kept the triumph from becoming simply a coronation for a potential tyrant. It was a ritual that celebrated power while simultaneously taming it. This use of public spectacle as a tool of political bonding was by no means unique to Rome. In ancient Egypt, the pharaohs participated in the Heb-Sed festival, a jubilee ceremony often held after 30 years of rule, designed to magically renew the king's strength and reaffirm his fitness to govern. The pharaoh would perform a series of ritual runs and physical feats, demonstrating that he still possessed the vitality to protect the kingdom and maintain the cosmic order, Mat. It was a public health check for the body politic, reassuring the people that their link to the gods remained strong. Centuries later, across medieval Europe, the joyous entry was a key ritual for new monarchs. Upon ascending the throne, a king or queen would make a formal, ceremonial entry into their major cities. The streets would be cleaned, stages would be set up for elaborate mystery plays, and fountains would run with wine. The new ruler would swear oaths to uphold the city's liberties and privileges, and in return, the citizens would pledge their loyalty. These events transformed the often distant concept of monarchy into a personal covenant, a direct relationship between the sovereign and the people, sealed not in a distant palace but in the shared space of the public square. The ultimate genius of these spectacles lay in their ability to make power a shared, emotional, and celebratory experience. A tax decree is a cold, bureaucratic document that can breed resentment. A new law is an abstract concept, but a triumph, a festival, or a royal entry, these were events. They were holidays, they were free entertainment that broke the monotony of daily life. The state distributed food, money, and sometimes even staged elaborate gladiatorial games or mock naval battles in flooded amphitheaters. By transforming the hard realities of military conquest and political authority into a festive, participatory celebration, the ruler forged a powerful emotional bond with the populace. The people weren't just subjects, they were an audience, then participants, and finally, beneficiaries. Their cheers were not forced, they were earned through a carefully engineered experience of shared glory and distributed spoils. This created a form of loyalty that was far deeper and more resilient than that born from fear alone. It was a loyalty built on a foundation of awe, gratitude, and collective pride. And just as the cheers from the spectacle began to fade, the ruler would cement this loyalty with something even more concrete and personal: the direct distribution of wealth and the minting of his image onto the very currency that fueled daily life. The spectacle of the triumph, with its roaring crowds and dazzling displays of wealth, created a powerful, momentary bond between the ruler and the ruled. But what happened when the parade was over, the streets were cleaned, and the people returned to their daily lives? How could that fleeting feeling of collective euphoria be translated into lasting loyalty? The answer lies in a ritual that was both profoundly simple and psychologically brilliant: the direct, tangible distribution of wealth and benefits. This was the ancient practice of largesse, a strategic performance of generosity that transformed cold, hard treasure into the warm currency of political support. An emperor might return from a campaign with his treasury overflowing with captured gold, but if he simply locked it away, that wealth was politically inert. Its real power was only unleashed when it was strategically given away, creating a vast, unspoken network of reciprocal obligation that stretched from the highest general to the lowliest citizen in the farthest province. This wasn't charity, it was a calculated investment in stability and consent, a way to make every recipient feel personally indebted to the benevolence of their leader. The most famous and systematic example of this was the Roman grain dole, or the annona. In a massive, sprawling city of over 1 million people, where many lived hand-to-mouth, the fear of hunger was a constant, destabilizing force. A hungry populace is a restive one, prone to riots and rebellion. By providing a regular, free distribution of wheat to its citizen population, the Roman state, and later the emperors directly, performed a masterstroke of social engineering. They addressed a fundamental human need, transforming a basic necessity into a tangible gift from the emperor himself. When a Roman citizen carried his monthly ration of grain home, he wasn't just carrying food. He was carrying a physical reminder that his well-being was tied directly to the emperor's continued favor. This created a powerful, self-interested reason for loyalty. Supporting the regime wasn't just an abstract political idea, it was a matter of putting bread on the family table. The emperor, in this carefully crafted narrative, was the paterfamilias of the entire Roman people, the generous father who provided for his children. This role was spectacularly amplified by the hosting of public games, the ludi. These were not minor distractions, they were colossal, state-funded entertainment spectacles that could last for weeks, featuring chariot races, gladiatorial combats, theatrical performances, and even mock sea battles in flooded arenas. The emperor would preside over these events in full view of the populace, sharing in the excitement and, crucially, taking credit for the entire experience. By providing this free, thrilling entertainment, the ruler associated his reign with joy, excitement, and communal celebration, making his leadership synonymous with public good times. Perhaps the most crucial recipients of this calculated generosity, however, were the legions. A disloyal army could topple an emperor in an afternoon, while a loyal one could secure his dynasty for decades. Roman emperors understood this fundamental truth intimately. Upon their ascension, it became a standard ritual to give a substantial cash bonus, known as a donativum, to every soldier in the army. This was not a reward for service in a specific battle. It was a direct payment for their personal loyalty to the new emperor. The message was unmistakable. My reign begins with a direct deposit into your purse. Your continued support ensures there will be more. This practice created a financial contract between the emperor and his troops that often superseded their loyalty to the abstract idea of the Roman state. The soldiers' pay came from the emperor, their pensions came from the emperor, their plunder was sanctioned by the emperor. This system of military largesse made the army a direct stakeholder in the success and stability of the imperial regime, turning the legions into both the shield of the empire and the bodyguards of the man who paid them. Yet, for all the immediate impact of free grain and cash handouts, the most pervasive and ingenious tool of propaganda was something far smaller and more everyday: the coinage itself. Imagine a world without newspapers, without radio, without any form of mass media. How could a central authority project a unified image and message across millions of people spread over thousands of miles? The Romans solved this problem with breathtaking efficiency by turning their currency into a miniature, portable billboard for the state. Every single coin that passed through the hands of a merchant in Syria, a farmer in Gaul, or a shopkeeper in Rome was a tiny, durable piece of political communication. The moment a new emperor took power, one of his most urgent and symbolic acts was to strike a new series of coins bearing his portrait. This was the ancient equivalent of a presidential press secretary announcing a new administration, but this announcement reached into every market, every home, and every transaction in the empire. The portrait on the coin was never a simple, realistic depiction. It was an idealized image designed to convey specific qualities. The emperor might be shown with a stern, determined jaw to emphasize his strength and resolve, or with a calm, serene expression to project wisdom and stability. He was often depicted wearing a radiate crown with spiky rays emanating from his head, explicitly linking him to the sun god Sol Invictus and marking him as a figure of celestial power and illumination. But the propaganda didn't stop with the image. The inscriptions on the coins, the legends that encircled the imperial portrait, were a masterclass in concise, powerful messaging. These were not the names of mint officials or dry technical details. They were single, potent words that broadcast the emperor's core virtues and accomplishments for all to see. A coin might be stamped with pietas, declaring the emperor's deep reverence for the gods and traditional values. Another might bear the word virtus, highlighting his manly courage and military prowess. Victoria celebrated his recent conquests, while Providentia assured the people of his wise foresight and care for the empire's future. One of the most potent and recurring inscriptions was PX, peace. This was a particularly clever piece of messaging. An emperor who had just emerged from a bloody civil war or who maintained his power through the constant threat of the legions could mint coins proclaiming PX, effectively reframing his reign as a golden age of tranquility and security. The coin became a promise, a daily reminder that the sometimes harsh reality of imperial rule was, according to the state, the very foundation of peace and prosperity. This control over the currency meant that the emperor's divine and benevolent nature was reinforced every time a citizen reached into their purse. It was a form of brainwashing by commerce, a continuous, low-level hum of propaganda that made the ruler's authority feel as natural and ever-present as the money used to buy a loaf of bread. This brilliant fusion of economic utility and ideological control created a seamless link between the emperor's generosity and his legal authority, which was itself about to be presented as a sacred extension of the divine will. But this brilliant fusion of economic power and public spectacle, for all its effectiveness, would have meant very little if it weren't backed by a system that could dictate right from wrong, that could resolve disputes, and that could punish transgressions. This brings us to a ritual that strikes at the very heart of social order, the act of lawgiving itself. Here, the ruler performed perhaps his most audacious feat of all. He presented his own decrees and judgments not as fallible human creations, but as the direct, unalterable wisdom of the gods. This was the promulgation of law as divine decree, a ritual that transformed a legal code from a list of rules into a sacred covenant, making obedience a spiritual duty and disobedience an act of cosmic rebellion. The most iconic and enduring image of this concept comes from ancient Babylon, in the form of a towering black stone pillar known as the Stele of Hammurabi. Carved at its summit is a breathtaking scene that tells the entire story. It shows King Hammurabi of Babylon standing in a posture of reverence, not kneeling, but standing face to face with the enthroned sun god, Shamash. Shamash, who was also the god of justice, is easily identifiable by the rays of light emanating from his shoulders. He is handing Hammurabi a ring and a rod, the ancient symbols of royal authority and measurement. This visual narrative is absolutely clear and intentional. Hammurabi is not the author of the laws inscribed below this image. He is merely the scribe, the divinely appointed messenger. The 282 laws that cover the rest of the 7-foot-tall stele, covering everything from property disputes and trade regulations to penalties for assault and malpractice, are presented as the literal words of the God of justice himself. This was a masterstroke of political theology. It meant that if a citizen felt a law was unfair or a judgment was harsh, they weren't just disagreeing with their king, they were questioning the wisdom of Shamash. The stele was not kept in a royal archive for bureaucrats to consult. It was erected in a public place for all to see, a permanent, stone-bound testament to the divine origin of the king's authority and the celestial foundation of the social order. This idea of the ruler as a living conduit for divine law did not fade with the Mesopotamian empires. It evolved and found new, powerful expressions. Centuries later, in the glittering, complex world of the Byzantine Empire, the emperor was seen as the nomos psychos, a Greek phrase meaning the living law or the law incarnate. This was a step beyond even Hammurabi's claim. The Byzantine emperor wasn't just receiving laws from God. His very person, his will, and his judgment were considered an extension of divine law on earth. His edicts and pronouncements were treated not as mere policy decisions, but as inspired clarifications of God's will for the Christian empire. This concept was ritually reinforced during the elaborate coronation ceremonies in the great church of Hagia Sophia. The patriarch would anoint and crown the emperor, but a critical part of the ceremony involved the new ruler swearing a solemn oath to uphold the faith and to dispense justice with impartiality. This oath wasn't a separate political act, it was the sacred foundation of his legal authority. It bound his role as supreme judge and lawgiver directly to his duty as the defender of the faith, making his legal power inseparable from his religious sanctity. To oppose the emperor's law was to oppose the divine order he represented and had sworn before God to protect. By framing civil law in this way, as a direct branch of the cosmic order, these rulers achieved something truly profound. They collapsed the distinction between legal obligation and moral or religious duty. A crime was no longer just a transgression against your neighbor or the state. It was a violation of the sacred harmony of the universe, a tear in the fabric of divine will. This created a psychological and social enforcement mechanism far more powerful than any police force. The fear of legal punishment was now amplified by the fear of divine wrath and the stigma of communal sin. For the average person, paying a tax or settling a debt according to the king's law became an act of piety, a way to demonstrate one's alignment with the gods and the proper functioning of the world. This system placed an immense burden of moral conformity on the population, making social obedience feel like a personal spiritual necessity. It transformed the ruler's legal code from a set of external constraints into an internalized compass for righteous living. The logical conclusion of this framework was stark and uncompromising. Rebellion or treason was therefore the ultimate sin. Challenging the king's authority wasn't merely a political crime, punishable by imprisonment or death. It was an act of blasphemy, a direct assault on the gods who had appointed the king and given him the law. This theological justification for power made dissent incredibly dangerous, not just physically, but socially and spiritually. A rebel was not just an enemy of the state, he was an enemy of the gods, a force of chaos threatening to plunge the entire community into divine disfavor. This belief could be used to justify the most severe punishments for political crimes, as the state was not just defending itself, but acting as the avenging arm of the divine. It created a society where questioning authority was made to feel inherently immoral, a dangerous temptation that risked bringing down catastrophe upon everyone. This absolute demand for loyalty, divinely mandated and legally enforced, could not be left to chance or to ordinary civil servants. It required a dedicated class of enforcers, individuals bound not by ordinary civic duty, but by unbreakable, sacred oaths that placed their allegiance to the ruler above all other ties. This incredible system of divine law, backed by the threat of cosmic retribution, was a powerful tool for controlling the civilian population. But for a ruler, there was always one group that required an even deeper, more unshakable form of loyalty: the army. A disloyal populace could grumble and protest, but a disloyal army could depose an emperor before the sun set. The ultimate guarantee of a ruler's power, therefore, was not just a legal code, but the creation of a military elite bound to him by something stronger than pay, stronger than patriotism, stronger even than fear. They were bound by sacred, unbreakable oaths that transformed their service into a religious vocation and their loyalty into a matter of eternal salvation or damnation. This was the 10th ritual of Ascension, the forging of a loyal military elite through ceremonies that connected a soldier's soul directly to the well-being of his commander-in-chief. In the Roman legions, this bond was crystallized in a powerful ceremony known as the sacramentum. We get our word sacrament from this term, and that is no accident. For a Roman soldier, this was not a simple promise or a contract. It was a sacred vow, a life or death oath sworn not to the Senate and the people of Rome, not to the abstract idea of the Republic, but directly and personally to the emperor himself. The ceremony was deeply solemn. A soldier would stand before his standards, the sacred eagles that were the soul of his legion, and swear to obey the emperor's commands without question, to never desert his post, and to sacrifice his life if necessary for the safety of the emperor and the empire. The genius of the sacramentum was in its spiritual framing. To break this oath was not just a breach of military discipline, it was sacrilegium, a sacrilege. It was an offense against the gods who were called upon as witnesses. A soldier who betrayed his oath was believed to have damned his soul, inviting divine fury not only upon himself but potentially upon his family and his entire unit. This elevated his duty from a professional obligation to a cosmic compact. His honor in this life and his prospects in the next were now inextricably tied to his fidelity to the man who was both his emperor and a living god. This practice of creating a divinely bound god was perfected in another great empire, Persia. The Achaemenid kings maintained an elite corps known as the Immortals, so called because their number was always kept at exactly 10,000. Any casualty or illness was immediately replaced, creating the illusion of an undying, perpetual force. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were the king's personal guard, his household troops, and the core of his field army. Their selection and induction involved rituals that emphasized their unique, sacred role as the divine protectors of the King of Kings. They were equipped with the finest weapons and wore distinctive robes and gold jewelry, marking them as a caste apart. Their loyalty was cultivated through a powerful combination of elite status, generous pay, and the constant reinforcement of their sacred duty. They were made to understand that their primary purpose was to form a living shield around the monarch, to be the final, unyielding bulwark against any threat, internal or external. Their identity was so completely fused with the king's safety that their own existence as an elite unit had no meaning without him. This created a group of men for whom protecting the ruler was not just a job, but the very definition of their honor and their reason for being. The psychological impact of these oaths and rituals on the individual soldier cannot be overstated. They performed a profound alchemy on his sense of self. A young man who joined the Roman legions might have been seeking pay, adventure, or citizenship, but after taking the sacramentum, he was no longer just a mercenary or a conscript. He was a sworn servant of a divine emperor, a guardian of the cosmic order as defined by the state. His identity was elevated. He was part of a sacred brotherhood bound by a shared holy vow. This transformed his perspective on hardship, discipline, and sacrifice. Marching through bitter cold or standing shield to shield in a bloody battle were no longer just physical ordeals. They were tests of his sacred word, opportunities to prove his piety and honor before the gods. His loyalty was no longer transactional, based solely on his wages. it was spiritual. The well-being of the emperor became synonymous with the well-being of the empire, and by extension, the soldier's own place in the universe. To betray the emperor was to betray the gods and to annihilate his own honor, making such a thought not just dangerous but unthinkable. This sacred bond, however, was not a one-way street. The most successful rulers understood that to demand absolute loyalty, they had to actively reciprocate and nurture that relationship. The emperor, as commander-in-chief, performed his own set of rituals to foster this connection. Before a major battle, it was common for the Roman emperor or his general to lead the troops in public prayers and sacrifices, seeking the favor of Mars, the god of war, and Jupiter, the king of the gods. He wasn't a distant figure watching from a hill. He was the chief priest of the army, conducting the religious ceremonies that would determine their collective fate. Perhaps even more powerful was the emperor's willingness to share in the hardships of his men. The stories of Alexander the Great marching alongside his soldiers through the Gedrosian desert or sharing their scant water rations are legendary because they illustrate this principle perfectly. When an emperor slept in a simple tent, ate the same hard bread, and exposed himself to the same dangers as the common legionary, it created a powerful emotional resonance. It proved that the sacred oath was a mutual commitment. The soldier was pledging his life to the emperor, and the emperor was demonstrating that he valued that life enough to share its struggles. This personal touch transformed the abstract divine emperor into a tangible, respected commander who earned loyalty not just through his office, but through his actions. The ultimate result of this intricate ritual of oath swearing and reciprocal bonding was the creation of a military class with a fiercely personal and spiritual allegiance to the ruler. The legions and the imperial guards became a potent bulwark against internal dissent, a dedicated force that could be relied upon to crush rebellions and ensure the stability of the regime. Their loyalty was directed at the person of the emperor, not the institutions of the state. This is why a popular general with the backing of his legions could potentially march on Rome and claim the throne. The soldier's primary loyalty was to him, not to the Senate. This system had its risks, but for a sitting emperor, it provided the ultimate insurance policy. While the civilian population might be kept in line by divine law and public spectacles, the military was bound by something far more intimate and powerful, a sacred vow that connected their very souls to the destiny of their leader. This guaranteed that the enforcement arm of the state remained not only strong, but personally devoted, creating an almost unbreakable foundation for imperial power. And this loyal military arm would soon prove absolutely essential, for the empires we are discussing were not homogeneous nation-states, but vast, sprawling territories filled with a dizzying array of different peoples, languages, and gods, all of whom had to be managed with a combination of force and ingenious spiritual diplomacy. Now imagine you are the ruler of a vast, sprawling empire, a colossal patchwork of territories stitched together by conquest and diplomacy. Your armies are formidable, your laws are strict, but you face a challenge that sheer force cannot solve. Within your borders lie dozens of different peoples, each with their own language, their own customs, and most importantly, their own gods. You could try to crush these foreign beliefs, to demand that everyone worship your state pantheon and abandon their ancestral traditions. But history shows that this is a recipe for constant, simmering rebellion. The human spirit fiercely defends its sacred ground. So, what is the solution? The most brilliant emperors discovered a masterful alternative, a ritual of intellectual and spiritual integration that didn't destroy local faiths, but instead absorbed them. This was the practice of syncretism, a sophisticated political strategy disguised as theological open-mindedness. and it became one of the most effective tools for managing the dizzying cultural diversity of the ancient world. The term syncretism comes from the idea of blending or combining different traditions into a new, unified whole. In practice, this meant that instead of telling a conquered people their god was false, the imperial authorities would perform a kind of divine matchmaking. They would identify one of their own state gods who shared similar attributes or domains with a local deity and simply declare them to be the same being, just worshipped under a different name and with slightly different rituals. This approach was not born of genuine multicultural curiosity. It was a calculated political maneuver of breathtaking elegance. It allowed a conquered people to feel that their identity was being respected, that their gods were not being dethroned but were being welcomed into a larger, more cosmopolitan divine family. The local elites, the priests and chieftains, could retain their status and influence by simply agreeing to add the emperor's name to their prayers and acknowledging the supremacy of the imperial pantheon. This co-option of the existing power structure was far cheaper and more stable than trying to replace it with outsider administrators who didn't speak the language or understand the culture. By validating local belief systems, the empire effectively disarmed them as catalysts for separatist movements. A rebellion wasn't just a fight for political freedom, it became a theological schism, and most people were reluctant to risk the wrath of the very gods who had just been given a promotion. One of the most deliberate and ingenious examples of this strategy was engineered by the Ptolemaic dynasty, the Greek rulers of Egypt after Alexander the Great. They inherited the throne of the pharaohs, but they were a tiny Macedonian elite ruling over millions of Egyptians with a deeply sophisticated and ancient religious tradition. The potential for cultural conflict and political instability was enormous. The solution was the creation of a brand new god, Serapis. This was not a god who emerged slowly from popular belief. He was essentially designed in a committee, a theological project aimed at unification. The Ptolemies, likely advised by the Egyptian priest Manetho, crafted Serapis as a hybrid deity who combined the most powerful and appealing elements of both Greek and Egyptian religion. From the Egyptian side, he drew on Osiris, the god of the afterlife and resurrection, and Apis, the sacred bull worshipped in Memphis, a symbol of strength and fertility. From the Greek side, he was fused with Zeus, the king of the gods, and Hades, the lord of the underworld. The resulting deity, Serapis, was portrayed as a majestic, bearded figure like Zeus, but often shown with a grain measurer on his head, symbolizing his role as a provider of abundance, a nod to his Egyptian roots. He was a god of the afterlife, healing, and fertility, appealing to the core concerns of both populations. The Ptolemies built a magnificent temple for him in Alexandria, the Serapeum, which became a major center of pilgrimage and worship for Greeks and Egyptians alike. By creating this shared divine figure, the rulers provided a common spiritual ground, a deity that both the ruling class and the native population could worship without feeling they were betraying their own heritage. It was a brilliant act of theological statecraft that helped bind two very different cultures together under a single crown. But the true masters of this ritual were undoubtedly the Romans, who developed the practice into a systematic policy known as the Interpretatio Romana, or Roman interpretation. As the legions advanced across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East, Roman governors and commanders were constantly encountering new and strange gods. Instead of dismissing them as primitive idols, Roman scholars and priests would carefully study them, looking for points of correspondence with their own pantheon. A local god of healing who was associated with springs might be equated with Roman Minerva. A powerful warrior god of a Celtic tribe would be identified with Mars. Perhaps the most successful and widespread example was the equation of the Celtic god Lugus, a deity of skills, arts, and travel, with the Roman Mercury. Both were associated with commerce, communication, and cleverness. By declaring that the Gauls and Britons were simply worshipping Mercury under his local name, the Romans performed a fascinating act of spiritual assimilation. A Celtic tribesman could continue to leave offerings at his ancestral shrine to Lugus, but in the eyes of the Roman state, he was now honoring Mercury. This meant he was, in a very real sense, participating in the official state religion. His local loyalty was harmonized with his new imperial identity. This policy was incredibly flexible and pragmatic. It allowed for a vast, diverse empire to function without the constant, bloody religious conflicts that would later plague other periods in history. The Roman pantheon became a kind of divine umbrella under which hundreds of local deities could find a place, their unique characteristics absorbed into the profile of a familiar Roman god. The ultimate beneficiary of this entire system was, of course, the emperor himself. By positioning himself as the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of this vast, syncretic religious network, he became the patron and protector of all these faiths. He was the one who restored temples, from the shrines of Jupiter in Rome to the sanctuaries of local river gods in distant provinces. He was the universal ruler for a universal, or at least universally accommodating, pantheon. This role massively amplified his authority. A subject in Roman Britain might never see the emperor, but he would see the emperor's name on inscriptions dedicating a local temple to Mars Camulus, a syncretic blend of the Roman war god and a local Celtic deity. The emperor's image was everywhere, overseeing this grand spiritual unification. This inclusive strategy was a powerful deterrent to rebellion. Why would a local priest whose god had been honored and incorporated into the imperial system risk his position by supporting a revolt? Why would a community whose traditions had been allowed to continue take up arms against a government that showed such respect? Religious friction, one of the most volatile forces in human society, was deliberately diffused. The empire's theological flexibility created a powerful, unifying inertia that made the status quo feel safe, respectful, and divinely sanctioned. This policy of religious incorporation, however, had its limits and its price. While local gods could be welcomed into the fold, there was one non-negotiable act that sealed the bargain and tested the ultimate loyalty of every subject. This symbolic act was the final ritual in the process of syncretism, a simple, universal gesture that demonstrated where a person's ultimate allegiance lay. For all the flexibility shown to local traditions, the state demanded a single, unifying performance of submission that everyone from every culture was required to perform, binding the entire diverse empire together in a common, visible declaration of loyalty to the central power that made such coexistence possible. This policy of absorbing local gods was a stroke of political genius, but it still left the emperor as one deity among many in a vast, crowded pantheon. To truly cement his authority over such a sprawling and diverse realm, a more direct, more personal, and absolutely non-negotiable form of reverence was required. This brings us to the 12th and perhaps most audacious ritual of all, the establishment of the imperial cult, the formal worship of the emperor himself. This was the ultimate logical conclusion of the priest-king archetype, the moment the intermediary between the people and the gods stepped out from behind the sacred veil and declared himself the proper object of devotion. Yet, it's crucial to understand that for many in the ancient world, this was not primarily a matter of deep, personal faith in the emperor's divine nature. It was, first and foremost, a brilliantly designed, universal test of political loyalty. The state was creating a single, simple, and symbolic act that every single subject, from a Roman senator to a Greek artisan to an Egyptian farmer, could perform to prove their allegiance to the central power that held the empire together. It was a ritual that transformed abstract political obedience into a tangible, public performance. The Roman implementation of this concept was both elegantly simple and ruthlessly effective. Throughout the empire, in every major town and city, you would find altars dedicated to the genius of the emperor. The genius was not the man himself, but his divine spirit, the protective, life-giving force that watched over his family and, by extension, the entire Roman state. The required ritual was straightforward and accessible to everyone. A subject, when called upon, would simply approach one of these altars, take a pinch of incense from a bowl, and cast it onto the glowing coals. As the fragrant smoke curled upwards, it was seen as a sacrifice to the emperor's divine spirit. That was it. No complex prayer was needed. No expensive animal sacrifice was required. It was a cheap, quick, and public declaration of loyalty. For the vast majority of people in the polytheistic Roman world, this was no big deal. Adding one more god, especially the spirit of the man who guaranteed peace and security, to the long list of deities you already acknowledged was a trivial matter. It was a small price to pay for social harmony and the benefits of Roman citizenship. The act itself was almost bureaucratic, a spiritual loyalty oath performed with a simple gesture. However, the absolute brilliance and the terrifying power of this system were revealed not by those who complied, but by those who refused. For early Christians and also for Jews, this single, simple act presented an impossible dilemma. Their core religious belief was in the one, supreme God, and their scriptures explicitly forbade offering worship to any other being. To throw that pinch of incense onto the altar was, in their eyes, to commit the gravest of sins, idolatry. For them, it was not a political formality, it was a spiritual line they could not cross. The Roman authorities, in turn, saw their refusal not as a matter of private conscience, but as an act of blatant treason. If you would not perform this basic act of loyalty to the emperor, how could you be trusted? How could you be a good citizen? The famous trials of Christians often centered on this very issue. The Roman magistrate would present the accused with a simple choice: make the offering and go free, or refuse and face execution. The conflict was absolute. The state had created a ritual that forced its subjects to publicly choose between their god and their emperor, and it treated that choice as the ultimate measure of a person's place within the imperial order. The martyrdom of these early Christians stands as a stark testament to the immense power the Romans had invested in this seemingly minor ritual. A parallel, though even more profound, expression of the imperial cult developed far to the east in Japan. Here, the concept was not based on a symbolic test of loyalty, but on a foundational myth that was woven into the very identity of the nation. According to the ancient chronicles of the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, the Japanese emperors are direct, unbroken descendants of the sun goddess Amaterasu Omikami. This isn't a metaphorical claim of divine favor, it is a literal statement of genealogy. The emperor is not merely a representative of the gods, he is a living part of their family, a blood relative. This made him an Akitsumikami, a manifest god or a god in human form. His person was considered so sacred that for centuries, common people were not even allowed to look directly upon him. Every aspect of his life, from his clothing to his diet to his daily routines, was governed by intricate rituals designed to maintain his purity and his connection to the celestial realm. In this system, the emperor's divinity was not a political tool in the same cynical way it could be in Rome. It was the fundamental, unchallengeable reality upon which the entire Japanese state and its national identity were built. To obey the emperor was to obey the divine will of the sun goddess herself. His authority was as natural and unquestionable as the rising of the sun, which his ancestors commanded. Whether in the pragmatic Roman model or the mythic Japanese one, the imperial cult served the same overarching purpose. It created a centralized, empire-wide ritual that deliberately transcended all local and regional loyalties. A Gallic chieftain might have his tribal gods, an Athenian citizen might worship Athena, and an Egyptian priest might serve Osiris, but they all were now also required to acknowledge a higher, unifying authority in the person of the emperor. The cult provided a direct, symbolic link that ran from every corner of the empire straight to the heart of central power. This was achieved through a constant calendar of reinforcement. Official festivals celebrated the emperor's birthday, the anniversary of his ascension to the throne, and his great military victories. Special sacrifices were performed in his name at state temples. In Rome, Asia Minor, and other provinces, magnificent temples were constructed specifically for the worship of the emperor and his deified predecessors. These were not quiet places of contemplation. They were bustling centers of civic life where public ceremonies, games, and distributions of food would take place. This constant cycle of ritual and celebration served as a continuous advertisement for the regime, drumming the message of the emperor's superhuman status and the duty of obedience into the minds of the populace year after year. This practice truly does represent the ultimate culmination of the journey from priest to king. In the beginning, the ruler was the priest, the one who performed the rituals for the gods. Then he became the king-priest, the one who claimed a special relationship with the gods. Finally, in the imperial cult, he becomes the god-king, the one who is the object of the rituals himself. He is no longer the servant of the divine. He has become the divine being served. This is the apex of the ritualization of power, the final step in a long process of blurring the line between mortal authority and celestial mandate. The emperor now sits at the very center of the spiritual and political universe he commands. But to sustain such an incredible claim, to make people believe, or at least act as if they believe, that a man is a god, requires more than just rituals and oaths. It demands an entire environment designed to produce awe, a world of breathtaking spectacle, rigid etiquette, and magnificent artistry that constantly screams one single, overwhelming message to all who witness it. This careful staging of majesty, this transformation of a human being into a living icon of power, required more than just grand ceremonies. It demanded that every single interaction, no matter how small, be infused with a sense of the sacred and the unapproachable. The daily life of the court was not a backdrop for these rituals. It was the ritual itself, a continuous, unbroken performance designed to carve an unbridgeable chasm between the ruler and the ruled. This was achieved through a meticulous and deliberate system of regalia, protocol, and an entirely invented language of power, all working in concert to scream a single, constant message: this person is not like you. They are a being apart, a figure whose very existence is a reflection of a higher, celestial order that you can witness but never touch. Consider the sheer sensory impact of the Byzantine emperor. When he appeared before his court, he was not merely a man in fine clothes. He was a walking constellation. His body was encased in heavy, rustling silks, fabrics so rare and expensive they were effectively a state secret, imported at great cost from the faraway lands of China. These robes were dyed a specific, deep shade of purple using a pigment extracted from thousands of crushed murex sea snails, a process so labor-intensive that the color itself, known as Tyrian purple, was legally forbidden to anyone outside the imperial family. to where it was a capital offense. Adorning this already magnificent canvas were cascading layers of pearls, shimmering emeralds, and polished sapphires, each stone carefully chosen and sewn into patterns that mirrored the starry heavens. The intention was explicit and overwhelming: to present the emperor as a living mirror of the cosmos, a terrestrial sun around whom the entire empire revolved. The weight of the robes, the glitter of the jewels, the forbidden nature of the color, every element was a physical manifestation of a burden and a glory that ordinary humans could not possibly comprehend, let alone bear. But this visual coding of superiority was only half the story. To be truly effective, the hierarchy had to be physically enacted, felt in the very bones of the subject. This is where rituals of posture and proximity came into play, and few were more powerful than the Persian custom of proskynesis. This was not a simple bow or a genuflection, it was the act of full prostration. A visitor granted an audience with the King of Kings was required to throw themselves completely to the ground, pressing their face to the floor in an act of total physical submission. This gesture was profoundly symbolic. It physically enacted the absolute power dynamic of the empire. The king, elevated on his throne, was the only vertical figure in a room of horizontal supplicants. The subject, in their prostrate position, was literally lower, their line of sight limited to the royal feet. This was a powerful, non-verbal language that everyone, regardless of their native tongue, could understand. It communicated a brutal, physical truth. Your entire being, from your head to your toes, acknowledges the unassailable supremacy of the one before you. It was a ritual that used the human body itself as a prop to demonstrate the cosmic chain of command. The control over access was another critical tool in this theater of power. An emperor or king could not be seen as accessible or ordinary. To maintain the aura of mystery and divinity, access to his person was a tightly controlled commodity, mediated by a labyrinth of complex ceremonies and gatekeepers. A courtier or foreign ambassador hoping for a word with the ruler might have to navigate weeks of protocol, bribing officials, and learning intricate codes of conduct just for the chance of a 5-minute audience. The journey to the throne room was itself a ritual of progressive revelation and intimidation. One might pass through a series of increasingly opulent antechambers, each guarded by more impressively armored and silent soldiers, the air growing thicker with incense and anticipation. By the time the visitor finally stood before the emperor, they had been psychologically primed for awe. The actual meeting was then governed by a strict script: how closely one could approach, the exact form of address to be used, the prohibition against initiating conversation or making direct eye contact. This entire process transformed a simple conversation into a rare and momentous privilege, an event to be recounted for years. It made the ruler's attention feel like a scarce and precious resource, a drop of divine favor bestowed upon a fortunate few. This manufactured scarcity was a brilliant psychological ploy, ensuring that even the most powerful nobles within the empire remained perpetually off balance, competing for a glimpse of the sun around which they orbited. Ultimately, the court was a grand stage, and every element from the costumes to the choreography was meticulously designed to produce specific, powerful emotions in its audience: awe, reverence, and ultimately, submission. The set was the palace, with its soaring ceilings and echoing halls meant to dwarf the individual. The costumes were the Imperial regalia, heavy with symbolism and wealth. The script was the unbending etiquette that governed every gesture and word. The courtiers and visitors were not merely spectators, they were essential players in this drama, their reactions of fear and wonder serving to validate the entire performance. When a nobleman prostrated himself, he was not just obeying a rule, he was actively participating in the reinforcement of the emperor's divine status. His submission was the final, crucial piece of the ritual, the proof that the theater was working. This constant, daily reinforcement through environment and behavior was far more effective than any decree or law. It created a world where the ruler's power was not something you thought about, but something you felt in the pit of your stomach every time you entered his presence. It was a form of psychological conditioning that made the social hierarchy feel as natural and unchangeable as the rising and setting of the sun. But a ruler's power, so carefully staged in the present, would be meaningless if it were forgotten or misremembered in the future. The grandest palace can crumble and the most thrilling triumph fades from memory. To achieve true immortality, a king had to conquer time itself, not just through stone monuments, but by seizing control of the very story that would be told about his reign. This brings us to a profoundly subtle yet all-encompassing ritual, the control of history through state-sponsored record-keeping. Imagine the immense power of being the one who gets to write the official script for eternity, to decide what events are worthy of remembrance, and just as importantly, what names and deeds are to be erased from existence as if they never happened. This was not the dry work of archivists, it was a sacred, ritualized act of crafting a permanent reality, a version of the past designed to flow seamlessly into a future that always justified the current ruler's authority. We can see this ritual performed with breathtaking scale and arrogance in the great palaces of the Assyrian Empire. The kings of Assyria, like the formidable Ashurnasirpal II, covered the walls of their vast ceremonial complexes with intricately carved alabaster panels. These were not mere decorations, they were the royal annals, a year-by-year chronicle of the king's accomplishments. But you will search in vain for any record of defeat, drought, or internal rebellion on these walls. Instead, you are met with a relentless, repeating narrative of divine-backed victory. The scenes show the king, always larger than life, leading his armies in battle, besieging enemy cities, and receiving the groveling submission of conquered chieftains. Inscriptions accompanying these images leave no room for ambiguity. They credit every success not to the strength of the army or the king's own strategy, but to the explicit and unwavering favor of the supreme god, Ashur. A typical inscription might read, I, Ashurnasirpal, king of the universe, king of Assyria, whom Ashur and the great gods have chosen. These annals were a form of report directed at the gods themselves, a permanent resume of piety and success meant to secure continued divine support. But they were also a stark warning to any future visitor, foreign ambassador, or potential rebel within the palace walls. The message was clear: this king's power is absolute, his victories are preordained by heaven, and to challenge him is to challenge the cosmic order itself. This was history as intimidation, carved in stone for all time. The ancient Egyptians refined this art of historical curation into an even more precise tool for legitimizing power, the king list. Found in temples across Egypt, these lists, such as the famous Abydos king list commissioned by Seti I, present a seemingly straightforward chronology of pharaohs. They show a perfect, unbroken line of succession, one ruler gracefully following another, each receiving the crown from his predecessor in a seamless chain of divine authority. But this seamless narrative was a masterful illusion, a deliberate act of political surgery. Look closely at these lists and you will find glaring, intentional omissions. The pharaoh Hatshepsut, one of Egypt's most successful rulers who commissioned magnificent temples and led prosperous trading expeditions, was almost entirely erased from the official record after her death. Her statues were defaced, her cartouches chiseled off walls, and her name was excluded from the king lists. Why? Because she was a woman who ruled as a full pharaoh, a disruption to the preferred masculine lineage. Similarly, the pharaoh Akhenaten, who attempted a radical religious revolution by replacing the entire pantheon with the worship of a single sun disk, the Aten, was systematically purged from history after his death. His city was abandoned, his monuments dismantled, and he was referred to only as the enemy in later records. By chiseling these rulers out of the official timeline, their successors were performing a powerful ritual of damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory. They were not just punishing a dead rival, they were asserting that these individuals were never legitimate pharaohs at all. Their reigns were presented as a chaotic, illegitimate blip, a temporary deviation from the eternal, God-given order that the current king now represented and restored. The individuals tasked with this sacred duty of shaping the past were far from independent scholars. They were scribes and historians who were almost always priests or high-ranking court officials, their livelihoods and social status entirely dependent on the ruler's favor. Their primary duty was not to objective truth, but to the glorification of the monarch and the state. In many cultures, the scribe's profession was itself considered a sacred calling, as they were the keepers of the magical and powerful written word. When an Egyptian scribe dipped his reed pen into ink to record the pharaoh's deeds on a scroll of precious papyrus, he was performing a ritual act. He was translating transient human actions into a permanent, magical form that would endure in the afterlife and guide the gods' judgment. The very materials used durable stone for public pronouncements, expensive papyrus for temple archives were chosen for their permanence, conferring an aura of unassailable truth upon the words they bore. This act of inscribing was a way of making the official version of reality concrete and unchallengeable. A story told around a campfire could change with each telling, but a royal inscription on a temple wall was fixed forever. Its authority derived from its sheer physical endurance and its sacred context. This monopoly over the means of historical production granted the ruler a power that reached beyond his own lifetime, shaping the judgment of posterity itself. By controlling what was written down and what was preserved, a king could directly influence how future generations would perceive his dynasty, his enemies, and his own legacy. He could transform a bloody coup into a peaceful ascension blessed by the gods. He could turn a costly stalemate on the battlefield into a glorious victory. He could ensure that his name would be remembered as a wise and just ruler, while his rivals would be forgotten or remembered only as tyrants and fools. This was the ultimate act of planting a forest in whose shade you would never sit. It was a long-term investment in legitimacy, creating a historical narrative so compelling and so deeply embedded in the cultural foundation that it would become the accepted truth for centuries, even millennia to come. This curated history, this carefully constructed story of divine favor and unbroken lineage, was not meant to remain abstract. It required a final, physical embodiment, a lasting testament that would stand long after the scribes and courtiers were gone. This drive for a permanent legacy naturally found its most profound expression in the ruler's final, eternal resting place, where the rituals of death would seal his historical narrative for all time. Of all the rituals we have explored, none carried a greater weight of responsibility or a deeper undercurrent of anxiety than the final one, the funerary rites and the construction of an eternal legacy. The death of a priest-king was not a simple end. It was a moment of profound national peril, a dangerous crack in the cosmic order that threatened to plunge the entire kingdom into chaos. The rituals surrounding his death and burial were therefore the most critical of all, meticulously designed to achieve two monumental goals: to successfully launch the deceased ruler on his final, most important journey to full godhood, and to ensure a stable, legitimate transfer of power to his successor, thereby securing the dynasty's future and the continued favor of the gods. This was not merely about honoring the dead. It was about performing a complex spiritual and political operation to guarantee the very survival of the state itself. To understand the sheer ambition of these rites, look no further than the Egyptian pyramid. We see it today as a silent, geometric tomb, but to the ancient Egyptians, it was something far more dynamic. It was a colossal machine for resurrection, a man-made mountain of power designed to ritually propel the pharaoh's soul from the mortal realm into the eternal cycle of the gods. Its smooth, gleaming white casing stones, reflecting the brutal sun, were meant to mimic the primordial mound of creation from which all life emerged. Its narrow, precisely aligned shafts pointed directly to the circumpolar stars, the imperishable ones which were believed to be the eternal resting place of the gods and the souls of the deified pharaohs. The entire structure was a single, monumental prayer in stone, an architectural spell to ensure the king's successful rebirth and his union with the sun god Ra, with whom he would travel across the sky each day and through the treacherous underworld each night. This was the ultimate destination of the priest-king's journey, not just to rule in the afterlife, but to become a fundamental part of the celestial machinery that sustained the universe. But the pyramid was only the final grand shell. The process that prepared the king for this journey was an elaborate 70-day-long ritual of preservation and transformation known as mummification. This was not simply about preventing decay. It was a sacred recreation of the body of the god Osiris, the first mummy and the lord of the afterlife. The internal organs were carefully removed, preserved in sacred canopic jars, each guarded by one of the four sons of Horus. The brain, considered unimportant, was discarded, while the heart, the seat of intelligence, emotion, and morality, was left in place to be weighed in the final judgment against the feather of Maat, the goddess of truth. The body was then packed with natron salt to desiccate it, anointed with sacred oils and resins, and meticulously wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen strips, within which were placed amulets and spells from the Book of the Dead for protection. This entire gruesome and costly procedure was a metaphysical overhaul, a ritual stripping away of mortal corruption to forge a new, eternal, and divine body capable of housing the king's spirit for all time. The final, crucial act before the sealed sarcophagus was placed within the pyramid's burial chamber was the opening of the mouth ceremony. This powerful ritual was the equivalent of throwing the spiritual switch. A priest, using a special adze tool, would symbolically touch the mouth, eyes, ears, and nose of the mummy and the statues of the king that would accompany him. This was not a gentle gesture, it was a ritual of reanimation. Its purpose was to restore the senses to the deceased king, to allow his spirit to see, hear, breathe, eat, and drink in the afterlife. It transformed the inert mummy and its statues from mere representations into viable vessels for the king's ka, his life force. Without this ceremony, the entire pyramid, the mummification, and the treasure were useless. The king's spirit would be trapped, blind and mute, unable to take its place among the gods. And then, of course, there was the treasure. The mountains of gold, jewelry, furniture, food, and weapons buried with him. This was not a display of posthumous greed. It was practical provisioning. The king would need his wealth, his status symbols, and all the comforts of his earthly life to maintain his divine authority and sustain himself in the world to come. A similar, though terrifyingly ambitious, vision of posthumous power was being constructed on the other side of the world, in ancient China. The first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, the man who unified China and whose name would echo for millennia, was obsessed with conquering death itself. His funerary project was not a pyramid pointing to the stars, but a vast subterranean empire mirroring the one he ruled in life. Historical records, later supported by the staggering archaeological discovery in the 1970s, describe a sprawling necropolis guarded by a terracotta army of over 8,000 life-sized soldiers, each with unique facial features, along with chariots, cavalry, and officers. This was not a symbolic token force. This was a complete operational military formation, buried in battle-ready formation to serve the emperor in the afterlife and protect him from any spiritual threats. The message was one of enduring, unchanging imperial power. The emperor's authority was so absolute that it transcended death itself, commanding the same obedience from his clay legions in the next world as he had from his human ones in this one. Recent scientific surveys have even revealed that the entire burial complex sits atop a massive, still unexcavated underground palace, complete with miniature rivers of flowing mercury, representing the great rivers of China, and a ceiling inlaid with pearls to simulate the starry night sky. Qin Shi Huang was not just planning for an afterlife, he was recreating his entire empire in microcosm, intending to rule it for all eternity. For the living, these staggering funerary practices sent a powerful and stabilizing message. The king's power was not extinguished by death, it was merely transformed. He was not gone. He had graduated to a higher, more potent form of existence as a divine ancestor, a permanent, watchful guardian of the dynasty he had founded. His continued well-being in the afterlife was directly linked to the health, fertility, and stability of the nation he left behind. A proper, ritually correct burial was therefore not a discretionary honor, it was a matter of national security. A neglected or improperly buried king could become a restless, angry spirit, bringing plague, famine, or military defeat upon his people. This belief created a powerful incentive for the court and the populace to ensure the rites were performed flawlessly, as their own future prosperity literally depended on it. This is where the ritual seamlessly intertwined with the raw mechanics of political succession. The successor's first and most sacred duty was to oversee the lavish funeral and correct burial of his predecessor. This was a critical test of his legitimacy and his piety. By properly venerating the dead king, the new ruler was performing several crucial acts at once. He was publicly demonstrating his filial piety, a cornerstone of virtue in most ancient societies. He was proving his understanding of the complex state rituals, showing he was fit for the sacred aspects of his office. Most importantly, he was positioning himself as the rightful heir in an unbroken chain of divine authority. He was the one chosen to maintain the relationship with the now deified former king, ensuring that the blessings of the ancestral spirits would flow to the new reign. In a very real sense, a new king's legitimacy began not with his own coronation, but with the successful completion of his predecessor's funeral. It was a ritual handover of cosmic responsibility, linking his own fledgling power to the eternal, divine power of the dynasty itself. And as the final rites were concluded and the tomb was sealed for eternity, the new ruler would turn from the world of the dead to face the world of the living, his own crown feeling suddenly heavier, his own mortality now a pressing and inescapable reality. Yet behind the golden masks and beneath the jewel-encrusted robes, there was always a human being, a person who had to wake up every morning and try to embody a divine ideal. The psychological weight of this performance was staggering, a burden we can scarcely comprehend today. Imagine the pressure of knowing that your every action, your every mood, even the state of your physical health, was not a private matter but a national omen. A simple cold or a bout of melancholy wasn't just an illness. It could be interpreted by priests and courtiers as a sign that the gods were displeased, that the cosmic harmony was fraying. A lost battle wasn't merely a military setback, it was a theological crisis, a public demonstration that the ruler might be losing his divine mandate. This created a state of constant, high-stakes performance anxiety, where the ruler was the lead actor in a play that never had an intermission, and a single flubbed line could mean the collapse of the entire production, and possibly his own life. We get a rare and poignant glimpse into this internal struggle through the private writings of the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. His book, known to us as Meditations, was never intended for publication. It was his personal journal, a series of thoughts and reminders written mostly during exhausting military campaigns on the empire's northern frontier. He didn't write it to impress his subjects or to craft a public image. He wrote it as a lifeline, a way to grapple with the immense responsibilities and temptations of his office. In its pages, we don't find a god-king boasting of his power. Instead, we find a man relentlessly admonishing himself to be better. He writes about controlling his anger, about dealing with difficult people, about accepting his duties without complaint, and about confronting his own mortality. He constantly returns to Stoic principles, reminding himself that his worth is not in external success or adulation, but in the integrity of his own character and his commitment to justice. This was the internal monologue of the most powerful man in the Western world, a desperate, private struggle to live up to the impossible ideal of the philosopher king, to maintain his humanity while wearing the mask of ultimate authority. This relentless pressure, this life lived under a microscope of divine expectation, naturally bred a deep and pervasive sense of isolation. The very court rituals designed to exalt the ruler also served to imprison him. The complex etiquette, the requirement of prostration, the layers of officials controlling access, all of it created a barrier that separated the emperor from genuine human connection. He was surrounded by people, yet utterly alone, never sure who he could truly trust. This isolation could curdle into a corrosive paranoia, a state of mind that saw conspiracies in every shadow. Consider the later years of the Roman Emperor Domitian. He became increasingly reclusive, spending hours alone in his palace, reportedly lining the walls of the porticos where he walked with polished moonstone so that he could see the reflections of anyone approaching behind him. He launched a series of treason trials, executing senators and former allies based on real or imagined plots. His fear was not entirely unfounded. He would ultimately be assassinated in a palace conspiracy. Domitian's story is a tragic example of how the system designed to protect the god-king could instead become a hall of mirrors, reflecting back only his own fears and insecurities until the distinction between prudent caution and self-destructive madness blurred beyond recognition. For other rulers, the psychological burden manifested not in retreat, but in a frantic, almost desperate, outward drive for validation. The need to constantly prove their worth to themselves and to their people could fuel a cycle of endless military campaigns and monumental building projects. The pharaoh Ramesses II, for instance, wasn't content to simply build a few temples. He had his name and likeness carved on virtually every available surface in Egypt and often chiseled over the names of previous pharaohs. He fought the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh, a clash that ended in a stalemate, yet he had the event commemorated on temple walls across Egypt as a glorious, singular victory ordained by the gods. This wasn't necessarily simple ego. It was the behavior of a man trying to inscribe his legitimacy so deeply into the stone of history that no one could ever erase it. He was building his own psychological armor, creating a public record of success so overwhelming that it might quiet the internal whispers of doubt and the external threats of rivals. Every new monument was another brick in the fortress of his own identity, a desperate attempt to make the performance of perfection feel real. This profound human cost forces us to see these figures not as remote marble statues, but as complex individuals trapped in a gilded cage of their own making. The glittering facade of absolute power often concealed a deep well of loneliness, anxiety, and existential dread. They were tasked with being the calm, divine center of the universe while grappling with all the very mortal frailties of the human condition: fear, insecurity, illness, and the knowledge of their own eventual death. Recognizing this adds a crucial layer of tragedy to the historical narrative. It reminds us that for every triumphant procession, there was a man lying awake at night, haunted by the responsibilities of his office. For every grand temple raised to his glory, there was a private struggle to reconcile the man with the myth. This internal tension, this chasm between the human being and the divine office, was the greatest, most unspoken vulnerability of the entire priest-king system. The structure of power was built upon the foundation of a single, fallible human psyche, and when that foundation cracked under the immense weight of expectation, the consequences could ripple out to shake an entire empire. Now let's zoom in on a true master of this ancient political theater, a man who didn't just use these rituals but perfected them into a seamless and enduring system of power. The rise of Rome's first emperor, Augustus, stands as the ultimate case study in the deliberate and masterful use of ritual politics. His story is a fascinating paradox. He emerged from a bloody series of civil wars that shattered the old Roman Republic, yet he managed to present his ascent not as a violent takeover, but as a pious and necessary restoration of tradition. His genius lay in his understanding that raw power was brittle, but power sanctified by ritual and wrapped in the revered cloak of the past was virtually unbreakable. He meticulously avoided the flashy, dangerous titles of king or dictator for life that had doomed his adoptive father, Julius Caesar. Instead, he accumulated a portfolio of seemingly traditional republican offices. He called himself Princeps, which simply meant first citizen, a title that sounded humble and collaborative, and crucially, he became Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the Roman state religion, giving him ultimate control over the spiritual life of the empire. This was the cornerstone of his strategy. He didn't destroy the old system. He hollowed it out and moved in, becoming its most devoted and powerful tenant. To understand the sheer brilliance of his approach, just look at his building program. When Augustus came to power, many of Rome's ancient temples had fallen into disrepair after decades of civil strife. He could have torn them down and built grand new monuments to himself, but he didn't. Instead, he launched a massive, widely publicized campaign to restore them. He repaired or rebuilt 82 temples in a single year, reviving the ancient cults and priesthoods that went with them. On the surface, this was the act of a deeply conservative man, a pious son returning Rome to its ancestral virtues. But the political message was deafening. By restoring the physical houses of the old gods, Augustus was visually and ritually linking his own rule to a mythical, golden age of Roman piety and strength. He was presenting himself as the defender of tradition against the chaos and impiety of the recent past. Every newly polished column and every revived festival was a piece of propaganda that said, "I am not an innovator, I am a restorer." The peace and prosperity we now enjoy is not a new invention of mine, but a return to the way things were always meant to be. He was using the past as a weapon to secure the future. This carefully crafted narrative of a restored golden age found its most potent and permanent expression in a document we now call the Res Gesti Divi Augusti, or the Deeds of the Divine Augustus. This was not a private memoir. It was his official autobiography, and he ordered it to be inscribed on bronze pillars and placed at the entrance to his mausoleum in Rome, with copies erected in temples across the empire. It is a masterpiece of ritualized propaganda, a first-person account of his reign written in the dry, factual tone of a state report. He lists his achievements not as personal triumphs, but as services to the state, the vast sums of his own money he spent on the Roman people, the gladiatorial games he funded, the colonies he established for veterans, the temples he built. He meticulously details the honors the Senate and people voluntarily bestowed upon him, creating a circular argument for his own legitimacy. The res gesti was his final, definitive word on his own legacy, a permanent, inarguable record carved in metal and stone that framed his absolute power as the benevolent and hard-earned reward for a lifetime of selfless service. It was the ultimate ritual of self-justification, designed to shape his story for centuries to come. Perhaps no single monument captures the aesthetic of his rule better than the Ara Passus Augusti, the altar of Augustan peace. This wasn't a towering victory column celebrating military conquest. It was a low, elegant marble altar enclosed by sculpted walls dedicated to the goddess peace. The reliefs that cover it are a visual symphony of his political ideals. On one side, we see a solemn, beautiful procession of the imperial family, including women and children, all depicted in a calm, dignified manner. They are not gods or heroes, but idealized Roman citizens, models of piety and family values. This was a direct contrast to the chaotic, violent world of the civil wars. On the other side, and on the interior, are scenes of bountiful nature and mythological foundations of Rome, linking Augustus's reign to the very origins and fertile prosperity of the land. The entire altar is a ritual space that physically embodies the central promise of his regime, that his leadership had brought an end to internal strife and ushered in an era of peace, fertility, and traditional virtue. It was a powerful, non-verbal argument that you could walk around and touch, a permanent sensory experience of the benefits of his rule. When we step back and look at the whole picture, the sheer comprehensiveness of Augustus's ritual strategy becomes clear. He didn't just seize power, he ritualized its acquisition and its daily exercise so thoroughly that the Republic's death looked, felt, and was celebrated as its glorious rebirth. He controlled the past by restoring its monuments. He controlled the present through his accumulation of traditional titles and his leadership of the state religion. And he controlled the future through his carefully managed legacy in the res gesti and monuments like the Ara Passus. He made his personal authority feel inseparable from the health, tradition, and identity of Rome itself. This blueprint was so effective, so psychologically resonant, that it became the operating manual for every Roman emperor who followed him for centuries. They would all borrow from his playbook, understanding that to rule the vast, diverse empire, one had to be more than a general or an administrator. One had to be the princeps, the pontifex maximus, and the curator of a grand, ongoing public ritual that convinced millions of people that their obedience was not just a duty, but a privilege. His success, however, throws into sharp relief the fate of those who failed to understand this delicate dance. Rulers who grasped for power without mastering the rituals required to make it legitimate and enduring. But what happens when the foundational logic of sacrifice, the very engine that drove so many of these king-making rituals, is called into question? This brings us to a story that stands in stark contrast to the imperial narratives we have explored, a story that introduces a profound and complicating ethical dimension to the ritual of power. The biblical account of the binding of Isaac, known in Hebrew as the Akedah, presents a gripping counter-narrative. Here, the patriarch Abraham, a figure revered for his faith, receives a terrifying and direct command from God to take his beloved son, Isaac, to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt sacrifice. The story unfolds with heartbreaking detail the journey to the mountain, Isaac's innocent question about the lamb for the offering, the building of the altar, the binding of the son, and the raising of the knife. At the very last possible moment, an angel of God calls out from heaven, stopping Abraham's hand and providing a ram caught in a nearby thicket as a substitute. The crisis is averted and Abraham's faith is confirmed, but the story leaves a seismic tremor in its wake, forcing us to confront the terrifying limits of sacrificial logic and the nature of obedience itself. While this is not a tale of a king's ascension, it cuts to the very core of the priest-king's role. In the empires we have discussed, the ruler was almost always the ultimate sacrificer, the one who performed the most important rituals to appease the gods. In some traditions, like the sacred marriage or the concept of the king's body being fused with the land, the ruler also became the symbolic sacrifice, the one whose life and vitality were offered for the fertility and stability of the kingdom. The Akedah holds this entire system up to a harsh, interrogating light. It presents a scenario where the ultimate sacrifice, the life of a firstborn son, the future of the lineage, is demanded. And then, in a stunning theological reversal, the story explicitly rejects it. The ram provided by God becomes a powerful, permanent symbol of substitution. The message seems to be that the divine itself has set a boundary. There is a line that even the most sacred ritual cannot cross. This can be read as a foundational argument against the practice of human sacrifice, establishing a revolutionary principle that divine authority is not arbitrary or bloodthirsty, but operates within an ethical framework. It suggests that the gods or God do not ultimately desire the death of the innocent, but rather the devotion of the heart. This introduces a deeply unsettling question into the priest-king model, one that would have terrified any ruler who claimed to be the sole interpreter of the divine will. The Akedah introduces the possibility that a command from the divine realm can be misunderstood, or that blind, unthinking obedience might not be the ultimate virtue. Abraham's test was a unique and direct communication, but for a king who derived his power from interpreting omens in bird flights or cracks in animal bones, the potential for error was immense. What if the king, convinced he was acting on a divine mandate, led his people into a disastrous war or ordered a morally repugnant act? The story of the Akedah whispers that there might be a higher law, an ethical principle that even a god-king must answer to. It suggests that true obedience might sometimes be tempered with a plea for mercy, or require a moment of moral reflection. This narrative tension reveals a critical and often overlooked vulnerability in the entire architecture of sacred kingship. The system's stability relied on the belief that the ruler's interpretation of the divine was infallible. The Akedah posits that it might not be, and that a command, even from the highest authority, can become morally untenable. This story serves as a crucial reminder that the grand rituals of power we have been decoding did not exist in a vacuum. They were always in a dynamic, often tense, dialogue with evolving ethical, philosophical, and theological ideas. The Akedah represents a powerful voice in that ancient conversation, a voice that challenged the raw, unchecked logic of sacrifice and demanded that power, no matter how divinely sanctioned, be held to a moral standard. It forces us to look beyond the throne rooms of Egypt and the forums of Rome and consider the deeper spiritual and ethical currents that flowed through the ancient world, currents that could, at times, erode the very foundations of imperial authority. This profound ethical challenge, born in a story of faith and averted sacrifice, compels us to widen our lens even further, to see how these patterns of sacred kingship manifested in civilizations that developed entirely independently across the vast oceans in the Americas and the distant empires of Asia. The echoes of these ancient power rituals were not confined to the Mediterranean world. Across the vast Atlantic Ocean and the sprawling continents of Asia, entirely separate civilizations, with no known contact with Egypt or Rome, arrived at a remarkably similar solution to the problem of rule. They too created the figure of the priest-king, a fusion of spiritual and political authority that proves this archetype is a fundamental thread in the tapestry of human history. Yet, when we place the Maya Kayuhul-Ajor of Mesoamerica side by side with the Chinese Son of Heaven, we see this universal idea expressed in stunningly different cultural dialects, revealing how the same core problem of leadership can be solved through both intensely personal, visceral sacrifice and through vast, impersonal, cosmic bureaucracy. Let's journey first into the humid, vibrant world of the classic Maya. Here, the ruler was not just a king, he was the Kayuhul-Ajor, the Holy Lord. This title signified that he was a sacred being, a man who literally contained a divine essence that set him apart from all other mortals. His power was not abstract, it was a shamanic force, and his primary role was to serve as a living conduit between the world of his people and the otherworldly realms of gods and deified ancestors. This connection was not maintained through quiet prayer alone, but through one of the most dramatic and painful rituals known to history, bloodletting. For the Maya, the cosmos was a fragile thing, perpetually on the verge of slipping back into chaos. The gods had shed their own blood to create the world and humanity, and this sacred debt needed to be repaid. The Holy Lord was the one responsible for making that payment. During key moments of his reign, his ascension, the birth of an heir, or the passing of a calendar cycle, he would perform a rite of auto-sacrifice. Using a stingray spine, a sharp obsidian blade, or a cord studded with thorns, he would pierce his own tongue, his earlobes, or even his penis, drawing forth copious amounts of blood, which would be collected on strips of paper and then burned. The rising smoke was believed to open a portal to the other world, a nourishing gift that sustained the gods and kept the cycles of time and nature turning. The imagery carved on Maya stelae powerfully captures this concept. We see rulers depicted in a trance state, with visionary serpents emerging from their bloodletting wounds. From the mouths of these serpents often appear the figures of gods or long-dead ancestors, proving the ritual's success. The king's body itself became the site of communion, his personal suffering and spilled blood the price of cosmic stability. This was a deeply intimate, physically demanding, and profoundly shamanic form of kingship, where power was validated through ecstatic pain and direct, visionary contact with the divine. Now let's pivot to the other side of the globe, to the immense and orderly world of ancient China. Here, the emperor ruled not as a shaman who spoke with individual gods, but as the Son of Heaven, the Tianzi. His mandate came from a fundamentally different kind of force, Tian, or heaven. Tian was not a personal deity with a will and a personality like the Maya gods. It was an impersonal, moral cosmic principle, the source of all order and harmony in the universe. The emperor's legitimacy, his mandate of heaven, was not proven through bloodletting or visions, but through his ability to maintain perfect harmony between the human world and the natural world. If he ruled with virtue and justice, heaven would send clear signs of its approval, predictable seasons, bountiful harvests, and social peace. If he became corrupt or incompetent, heaven would withdraw its mandate, signaling this withdrawal through natural disasters like floods, earthquakes, or famines. These were not random tragedies, they were cosmic report cards, clear indications that the emperor had failed in his primary duty and that rebellion was now justified. The rituals of the Chinese emperor, therefore, were not about personal ecstasy but about perfect, bureaucratic precision aimed at aligning human activity with the celestial order. The most important of these took place at the magnificent Temple of Heaven complex in Beijing. Every year at the winter solstice, the emperor would lead a solemn, meticulously choreographed procession to the park. No ordinary citizen was allowed to witness this. It was a private conversation between the Son of Heaven and his celestial parent. Dressed in majestic blue robes embroidered with symbols of the cosmos, he would offer sacrifices of food and wine on the circular, three-tiered marble platform, a structure designed to represent the connection between heaven, earth, and the underworld. There were no blood-soaked papers or trance states here. Instead, every movement, every musical note, and every ritual object was prescribed by ancient tradition. The emperor's role was not to innovate or to have a personal experience, but to perform his part in a cosmic mechanism with flawless accuracy. Another key ritual was the ceremonial plowing of the first furrow each spring. Here, the emperor would take a plow in his own hands and turn the earth, symbolically initiating the agricultural cycle. This act framed him not as a warrior or a shaman, but as the head of a vast agrarian family, the one whose actions ensured that the relationship between the human labor of farming and the natural fertility of the earth remained in harmonious balance. His power was cosmic, but its expression was deeply practical and administrative. So, what does this stark contrast tell us? The Maya Holy Lord and the Chinese Son of Heaven were both unequivocally priest-kings. They were the ultimate authorities responsible for the spiritual and physical well-being of their entire realms. But the nature of that responsibility and how they performed it could not have been more different. The Keyuhul Ajor's power was intensely personal and shamanic. His body was the ritual instrument, and his legitimacy was continually renewed through acts of extreme personal devotion and physical suffering. He was the center of a vibrant, often terrifying spiritual drama. The Chinese emperor's power, by contrast, was bureaucratic and cosmic. He was the chief administrator of a pre-existing natural order, and his legitimacy was judged by his success in maintaining societal and environmental harmony. He was the calm, virtuous center of a vast celestial bureaucracy. One system was built on the ecstatic vision of a single man, the other on the predictable rhythms of the natural world and the moral conduct of the state. This independent development in worlds that never knew each other is perhaps the most powerful evidence we have. It strongly suggests that the fusion of spiritual and political authority is not a historical accident, but a recurring, almost instinctive, solution that human societies discover when faced with the monumental challenge of creating large-scale, stable civilizations. It is a way of embedding the often brutal and arbitrary nature of political power within a larger, sacred story, making it feel inevitable, necessary, and divinely ordained. The Maya did it with blood and vision serpents. The Chinese did it with cosmic harmony and ceremonial plowing. The methods were worlds apart, but the underlying goal of transforming might into sacred rite was exactly the same. But in the shadows behind the grand public ceremonies and the glittering spectacles, there existed another, more subtle ritual of power, one that thrived not on revelation but on concealment. This was the deliberate and potent weaponization of secrecy and esoteric knowledge. Imagine a society where the most profound truths about the universe, life, and death were not available to everyone. They were carefully guarded secrets, passed down in whispers through generations of a select few. Now, imagine that the ruler, the king or emperor, was not just aware of these secrets, but was their ultimate guardian and master. This positioning transformed him from a mere political leader into the sole keeper of mysteries upon which the very survival of the state supposedly depended. It created a powerful hierarchy of understanding, a pyramid of knowledge with the ruler at its absolute apex. For the average person, the king's authority was justified by public rituals and divine ancestry. But for those in the know, his power was rooted in something even deeper, a profound, esoteric wisdom that commoners could not even begin to grasp. This strategy made his authority seem unassailable because it could not be publicly debated or questioned. How do you argue against a truth that is deliberately kept hidden from you? The ruler's decisions, no matter how perplexing, could always be explained away as being based on secret, higher knowledge that the populace was not privileged or pure enough to understand. We can see this principle operating with brilliant clarity along the banks of the Nile. In ancient Egypt, the journey to the afterlife was the central preoccupation of existence, and the guidebook for this perilous voyage was a collection of spells and instructions we now call the Book of the Dead. But for the Egyptians, this was not a public text you could buy in a marketplace. It was a sacred, secret manual, and its most powerful incantations and the intricate rituals for navigating the underworld were knowledge reserved exclusively for the pharaoh and the highest ranks of the priesthood. The pharaoh was initiated into these mysteries as part of his sacred training. He learned the true names of the fearsome guardians he would meet, the passwords to get past the many gates of the afterlife, and the precise words to speak when his heart was weighed against the feather of truth. This exclusive knowledge served a crucial dual purpose. On one hand, it genuinely prepared the king for his own divine destiny, equipping him to become one with Osiris and Ra. On the other hand, it was a masterful political tool. It created a tangible, spiritual chasm between the ruler and the ruled. An ordinary Egyptian could hope for a decent afterlife through a simple, positive judgment, but only the pharaoh, armed with his exclusive knowledge, was guaranteed to successfully merge with the gods. This made him fundamentally different, a being who operated on a level of reality that was closed off to everyone else. His earthly commands, therefore, were not just the whims of a man, they were the edicts of someone who understood the cosmic rulebook from cover to cover. This same dynamic of secret knowledge creating elite power structures flourished in the classical world through the institution of mystery cults. The most famous of these was the Eleusinian Mysteries, based in the town of Eleusis near Athens. For nearly 2,000 years, this cult promised initiates a profound revelation about the meaning of life and the fate of the soul after death, centered on the myth of the goddess Demeter and her daughter Persephone. What made the mysteries so powerful was the absolute, inviolable oath of secrecy that every initiate had to swear. To reveal what happened during the culminating rites was a crime punishable by death. And we, today, still do not know the exact nature of the secret that was revealed, because that oath was so effectively kept. What we do know is that the promise of this exclusive truth was incredibly attractive to the elite of the ancient world. From the great playwright Aeschylus to the Roman orator Cicero, and significantly to several Roman emperors like Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful and educated men of their age underwent initiation. For an emperor, being an initiate of Eleusis was a political and spiritual masterstroke. It placed him within an exclusive pan-Mediterranean club of the influential and enlightened. It allowed him to claim a form of legitimacy that transcended the crude mechanics of politics and military force. He was not just the commander of the legions, he was a soul who had been shown the ultimate truth. This membership created a powerful bond with other elite initiates across the empire, fostering loyalty based on a shared, sacred experience that was denied to the common masses. The true genius of this strategy was the way it framed the very nature of the ruler's authority. Public religion was for everyone. It was the shared stories, the festivals, the temples that everyone could see and participate in. But esoteric knowledge, the secrets of the mystery cults and the hidden texts, was for the few. By controlling or actively participating in these secret traditions, a ruler could effectively say to his subjects, "You see the surface of my power, the public ceremonies and the laws. But what you see is only the shadow of the real truth. The deep, underlying reasons for my rule are based on profound mysteries that you are not equipped to handle." This was the ultimate political trump card. It made the king's authority seem more profound, more ancient, and more deeply rooted in the fabric of the cosmos than any rival's claim could ever be. A challenger might have a larger army or more wealth, but could he recite the secret spells that ensured the Nile would flood? Did he know the true name of the god that held the universe together? Had he witnessed the sacred vision at Eleusis, this weaponization of secrecy built a fortress around the ruler's legitimacy that was almost impossible to besiege with conventional arguments or force. It placed the foundations of his power in a realm beyond scrutiny, in the silent, impenetrable vault of the initiated. Now consider the sheer density of this symbolic language, how a single, well-chosen image could carry the weight of an entire political philosophy. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was never depicted without his core regalia, the crook and the flail. These were not just farm tools rendered in gold and precious materials. The crook, used by shepherds to gently guide their flocks, represented the king's role as the caring guardian of his people, the one who would lead them to safety and prosperity. Its partner, the flail, used for threshing grain, carried a much sterner message. It symbolized the king's power to punish, to discipline, and to separate the wheat of loyal subjects from the chaff of rebels and criminals. Together, held crossed over the pharaoh's chest in a pose that became iconic, these two objects communicated the entire contract of Egyptian kingship. The message was simple, direct, and unforgettable. The ruler is both your nurturing shepherd and your strict judge. His power encompasses both benevolent care and the capacity for brutal retribution. You are safe within his flock, but step out of line and you will feel the sting of his authority. This was a complete ideology of power, condensed into two portable symbols that appeared on every statue, in every temple relief, and in every tomb painting, ensuring that no Egyptian could ever forget the dual nature of the authority that governed their lives. This visual shorthand extended far beyond personal regalia to encompass the very identity of the state. For Rome, no symbol was more potent than the eagle. Initially just one of the 5 animal standards carried by the legions, the aquila, or legionary eagle, was transformed by the reforms of the general Gaius Marius into the sole, supreme symbol of the entire Roman military. But its meaning ran much deeper. The eagle was sacred to Jupiter, the king of the gods, the embodiment of sky, lightning, and sovereign power. By adopting the eagle as its primary emblem, the Roman state was making a breathtaking claim. It was declaring that the might of Rome was not merely human. It was an extension of Jupiter's own celestial authority. To follow the eagle standards into battle was to fight under the direct auspices of the king of the gods. To lose an eagle in combat was a catastrophe of both military and spiritual proportions, a sign that Jupiter had turned his face away. Conversely, to capture an enemy's eagle was the ultimate war trophy, proof that your gods had triumphed over theirs. The eagle was more than a mascot. It was a sacred totem that fused religious faith, military morale, and imperial ambition into a single, powerful image. It told every citizen and every subject that Rome's destiny was written in the stars, sanctioned by the greatest power in the universe. Perhaps the most sophisticated evolution of this symbolic encoding occurred in the Byzantine Empire, where classical art met Christian theology to create a new visual language for a new kind of empire. In the great churches like the Hagia Sophia, the central dome was often occupied by a magnificent mosaic of Christ Pantocrator, Christ the Almighty Ruler of the universe. This was not a simple religious image. Artists and imperial patrons engaged in a subtle but powerful form of visual politics. They frequently rendered the face of Christ with the distinct features of the reigning emperor. The same hairstyle, the same jawline, the same solemn expression. This was not an attempt to say the emperor was Christ, but rather to create a profound symbolic parallel. Just as Christ ruled as the divine king of heaven, so too did the emperor rule as his divinely appointed vice-regent on earth. The emperor's earthly authority was presented as a direct reflection of Christ's celestial sovereignty. When subjects looked up in awe at the face of the Pantocrator, they were also, on a subconscious level, seeing the face of their emperor. This visual fusion collapsed the distance between the heavenly and the earthly throne, making obedience to the emperor feel like an aspect of Christian piety itself. It was a masterful co-opting of religious awe for the purposes of political stability. The repetition of these symbols was not accidental. It was a deliberate and relentless campaign of visual indoctrination. Think of it as a society-wide ritual, but one that happened in the background of everyday life, bypassing the conscious mind to speak directly to the subconscious. These images were not confined to expensive temples or palaces that few could enter. They were everywhere. They were on the coins you used to buy your daily bread, each one a tiny, handheld monument to the emperor's profile and his virtues. They were carved into the facades of public buildings and commemorative arches, framing the city's landscape with messages of power. They were woven into the textiles of court officials and stamped onto the bricks used in imperial construction projects. This constant, low-grade exposure had a cumulative psychological effect. It normalized the ruler's authority, making it seem as natural and ever-present as the air itself. There was no escaping the iconography of power. It was in your pocket, on your street, and in the very structures that defined your world. This repetition trained the population to recognize and internalize the state's preferred narrative without their ever needing to read a single line of official propaganda. They learned the language of power through constant, silent immersion. This visual language was also ruthlessly enforced through artistic conventions that left no room for ambiguity. In the colossal stone reliefs that adorned the palaces of the Assyrian kings, we see one of the most straightforward rules of this symbolic grammar, hierarchical scale. In these dramatic scenes of lion hunts and military conquests, the king is always, without exception, depicted as the largest figure in the composition. He towers over his enemies, who are shown as small, chaotic, and often crumpled under the hooves of his chariot horses. He is even larger than his own loyal soldiers and courtiers. This was not a reflection of reality. It was a declaration of ideological truth. The king's physical size on the wall was a direct measure of his importance in the cosmic order. His immense stature communicated that he was the central, pivotal figure around which the entire empire revolved. All other human life was secondary, smaller, and less significant. This visual hierarchy made the social and political hierarchy instantly understandable to anyone, regardless of their literacy or background. It was a way of using art to make inequality look like a simple, unchangeable fact of nature. Art also had the power to transform complex and messy historical events into clean, triumphant narratives that served the state. One of the most brilliant examples of this is Trajan's Column, which still stands in Rome today. This is not a static monument. It is a 200-foot-tall stone scroll telling the story of Emperor Trajan's 2 successful campaigns against the Dacians. The story spirals upward in a continuous marble frieze, packed with intricate scenes of Roman legions building forts, crossing rivers on pontoon bridges, engaging in disciplined combat, and receiving the submission of the defeated enemy king. The column is a masterpiece of ritualized storytelling. It presents the war not as a chaotic and bloody struggle, but as an orderly, almost mechanical process of Roman superiority and imperial benevolence. The violence is sanitized, the Roman soldiers are depicted as heroic and unified, and Trajan himself appears repeatedly as the calm, commanding center of the action. This was history as the emperor wanted it to be remembered, a permanent public record that was meant to be read by the populace as they walked around the base of the column. It offered a single, state-approved version of the truth, a visual epic that celebrated conquest while masking its human cost, turning military expansion into a beautiful and awe-inspiring work of art. Ultimately, this entire symbolic system was designed to be a closed loop, a self-reinforcing language that permitted only one interpretation. It was not open for debate or personal reflection. The state-controlled art presented a single, monolithic truth. The emperor is divine, the emperor is victorious, the emperor is the benevolent father of his people. There were no alternative viewpoints carved into the temple walls, no critical perspectives minted on the coins. This visual environment taught citizens how they were supposed to see their ruler. By constantly presenting the emperor in the company of gods, towering over his enemies and adorning him with symbols of justice and care, the art trained the eye and the mind. To be a good subject was to learn this symbolic language and to accept its premises without question. It was to look at a statue of the emperor and automatically feel a mixture of reverence, gratitude, and fear. It was to see his face on a coin and be reminded of the source of order and prosperity in your life. This visual propaganda was the bedrock upon which the theater of state was built, a silent, powerful partner to the chants, the processions, and the public speeches that filled the air, together creating an immersive sensory experience of power that was almost impossible to resist. But to truly master every dimension of human experience, a ruler had to conquer an even more fundamental force, the relentless, unstoppable flow of time itself. Imagine the profound power of being able to dictate not just what people do, but when they do it, to weave your own name and your own story into the very fabric of the days, the seasons, and the years. This was the ultimate ritual of control, the commandeering of the calendar, transforming it from a simple tool for tracking seasons into a sacred map of state-approved identity and a permanent, repeating advertisement for the regime. By seizing the calendar, a king or emperor could orchestrate the entire rhythm of public life, ensuring that the population's shared experience of time was a continuous, year-long celebration of his power, his legacy, and his divine right to rule. The Roman approach to this was breathtakingly direct and has left a permanent mark on how we still measure our year today. The successors of Julius Caesar did not simply honor his memory, they carved his name into eternity. The month of Quinctilis was renamed July in his honor, a move that permanently shifted the linguistic landscape. Not to be outdone, his great-nephew and heir, Augustus, ensured that the following month, Sextilis, was rebranded as August. This was far more than a tribute, it was a brilliant act of temporal colonization. Every time a Roman farmer planned his harvest, every time a merchant dated a contract, every time a family celebrated a birthday, they were forced to speak the names of these deified rulers. The calendar became a constant, low-level hum of propaganda, a linguistic ritual that embedded the imperial dynasty into the most basic cognitive structures of daily life, making the presence of the emperor as natural and expected as the turning of the seasons. This renaming of months was just the beginning. The Roman emperors, understanding that empty time was politically dangerous space, filled the calendar with a new liturgical year centered entirely on the imperial person. They established a whole new cycle of public holidays, or feriae, dedicated to celebrating events in the life of the emperor. His birthday, his dies imperii, the anniversary of his ascension to the throne, and his great military victories all became state-mandated festivals. On these days, public business would halt, sacrifices would be offered at temples for the emperor's well-being, and often the state would fund public games, races, and distributions of food. This transformed abstract political milestones into tangible public benefits. A citizen didn't just hear that the emperor had been in power for 10 years. They got a day off work and free bread to celebrate it. This created a powerful, positive association between the passage of time and the benevolence of the ruler. His continued rule was framed not as a static condition, but as a series of gifts to the people, each anniversary bringing another round of public joy and celebration. The year was no longer a neutral cycle of nature. It became a biographical timeline of the emperor himself, a recurring narrative of his greatness that everyone was compelled to participate in, year after year. A similar but even more profound ritual concerning time and the king's body was performed along the Nile. For the Egyptian pharaoh, the most dangerous threat to his legitimacy was not a foreign army, but the simple, inexorable process of aging. How could a man who was the embodiment of a youthful, vigorous god like Horus continue to rule as his own strength inevitably declined? The solution was the Heb-Sed festival, one of the most ancient and mysterious rites of kingship. Traditionally held after a pharaoh had ruled for 30 years, the Heb-Sed was a massive public ritual of renewal designed to magically recharge the king's vitality and reaffirm his fitness for office. The ceremony was a spectacular piece of political theater. The pharaoh would dress in a short, tight kilt, a garment of youthful athleticism, and would perform a ritual run around a specially designed courtyard, often while carrying sacred ritual objects. This was not a symbolic jog. It was a physical test, a public demonstration that the king still possessed the stamina and strength to protect the kingdom and maintain the cosmic order, Mat. He would also be ceremonially recrowned, receiving the regalia of kingship all over again, symbolically restarting his reign. The entire festival was a grand reset button on the king's biological clock. It confronted the uncomfortable reality of an aging monarch head-on and presented a spectacular, magical solution. By ritually shedding his accumulated years, the pharaoh could continue to project the image of eternal, divine vigor, reassuring his people that the vital link between the human and divine realms remained as strong as ever, regardless of the wrinkles on his face or the gray in his hair. The cumulative effect of all these temporal manipulations was a form of social synchronization on a massive scale. The ritualization of time meant that the entire population's annual cycle of work, rest, and celebration was orchestrated by and performed in honor of the state and its ruler. From the humblest farmer to the wealthiest senator, everyone's life moved to the same rhythm, a rhythm dictated by the imperial calendar. This created a powerful, shared temporal experience that bound the empire together. A citizen in distant Gaul and a citizen in the heart of Rome might never meet, but they were both observing the same festival for the emperor's birthday on the same day. This shared calendar created a sense of imagined community, a collective identity defined by a common timeline. It constantly reminded people of the ultimate source of order in their lives. The changing of the seasons was a natural phenomenon, but the interpretation of those seasons, when to plant, when to harvest, when to celebrate, when to mourn, was now mediated through the lens of state power. The ruler positioned himself as the master of time, the one who brought coherence and meaning to the chaotic flow of days and years. This control extended beyond the annual cycle to encompass the entire sweep of history. The king's own biological life cycle, his birth, his coronation, his jubilees, and ultimately his death became the central timeline of the state's official history. The years of his reign became the primary way of dating events. Inscriptions and official documents would be marked in the 5th year of the reign of King so and so. This practice effectively made the king's body and his lifespan the central clock of the nation. His personal milestones became the epoch-making events around which all other history was organized. This had a profound psychological effect. It framed the entire narrative of the state as an extension of the ruler's personal story. The nation's prosperity was his prosperity. The nation's victories were his victories. The nation's very existence in time was defined by his. This mastery of temporal rhythms, from the daily use of his name on the calendar to the grand, once-in-a-lifetime jubilee festivals, demonstrates the totality of the ritual control exerted by the priest-king. He didn't just rule space, he ruled time, ensuring that every moment, from the smallest to the most monumental, was infused with the indelible stamp of his authority. This deep, chronological programming of society ensured that loyalty was not just a political stance, but a habit ingrained in the very way people experienced their lives, a constant, subtle reminder that the order they enjoyed was a direct gift from the throne, a rhythm set by a hand that claimed to guide not just the fate of men, but the turning of the years themselves. And so we arrive at the present day, in a world that has ostensibly left behind the crowns and scepters of divine monarchs. The idea that a leader rules by the explicit will of the gods has, for the most part, vanished from our political discourse. Yet, if you know where to look, you will see that the ancient ritual strategies of imperial ascension did not disappear. They simply evolved, putting on a modern suit and tie. The psychological machinery that transformed a priest into a king is still humming away, now powering the vast theater of modern statecraft and corporate leadership. The symbols have changed, but the underlying human needs for order, meaning, and a figure to believe in have not, and our contemporary rituals are meticulously designed to meet those very same needs. Consider the inauguration of a United States president. This is one of the most powerful secular rituals in the modern world, a ceremony whose every detail is loaded with symbolic meaning inherited directly from our ancient past. The event is a masterclass in legitimizing power through performance. It begins with the oath of office, sworn on a Bible, a direct echo of the sacred oaths sworn by kings on religious objects, binding the leader's promise not just to the Constitution, but to a higher moral authority. This is followed by the inaugural address, which is far more than a policy speech. It is a modern version of a ruler promulgating his vision as a new law for the land, a moment where he attempts to capture the national spirit and define the coming era in his own terms. Then comes the parade down Pennsylvania Avenue, a clear descendant of the Roman triumph. The newly empowered leader, now surrounded by the protective secrecy of the presidential limousine instead of a chariot, processes before the people, who are no longer subjects but citizens, yet who still participate in the same dynamic of collective celebration and witnessed authority. The entire day is a carefully scripted sequence designed to achieve one primary goal: to mark a peaceful and legitimate transfer of power, transforming a political winner into a national leader. It reassures the population that the often chaotic and divisive process of an election has concluded, and order has been restored under a new, accepted head of state. This ritualization extends beyond the beginning of power to its end. State funerals for great leaders like the one held for Winston Churchill are not merely sad occasions for mourning. They are epic, choreographed spectacles with a profound political purpose: to define a leader's legacy for the national consciousness and to guide the public through a moment of collective grief and transition. Every element is symbolic: the gun carriage that carries the coffin, the meticulously planned procession route, the lying in state where thousands file past to pay their respects. These are all rituals that elevate an individual's death into a national event. They transform a mortal man into a permanent, heroic figure in the country's story. The ceremony serves to consolidate the memory of the leader, smoothing over the complexities and controversies of their life and presenting a unified, sanitized narrative of service and greatness. It is a final act of myth-making, ensuring that the leader's contribution is cemented in the annals of the nation's history, much like the royal annals of Assyria or the king lists of Egypt, which curated a selective and glorious past for their rulers. Perhaps the most significant evolution in these power rituals has been the invention of new technologies that allow for a different kind of connection. In the ancient world, an emperor's accessibility was a carefully staged performance, a brief, awe-inspiring audience in a vast throne room. In the 20th and 21st centuries, mass media has perfected this illusion of intimacy on a colossal scale. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's fireside chats on the radio were a revolution in political communication. His calm, conversational tone, speaking directly into the homes of millions of Americans, created a powerful sense of personal connection and trust during a time of profound crisis. This was the modern equivalent of the emperor presenting himself as the paterfamilias, the benevolent father of the nation. Today, televised addresses from the Oval Office or staged town hall meetings serve the same function. The leader appears in a setting designed to feel personal and direct, looking into the camera lens as if making eye contact with every single viewer. This breaks down the perceived distance between the powerful and the populace, fostering a sense of familiarity and trust that is essential for maintaining modern political legitimacy. It is a ritual of intimacy performed on a mass scale. The stage for these rituals is vast and varied. Political party conventions are not just internal meetings, they are week-long television productions designed to present a unified, energetic, and optimistic front to the nation. The balloon drops, the perfectly timed speeches, the repeated chanting of slogans. This is all a form of political theater aimed at generating excitement and loyalty, much like the public games and festivals funded by Roman emperors to associate their reign with public joy. Military parades in capitals like Moscow or Pyongyang are even more explicit in their symbolism, directly recalling the triumphal processions of old, displaying raw military power to both inspire national pride in the populace and to send a stark message of strength to rival states. Even the seemingly mundane staged signing of legislation is a ritual. The president or prime minister surrounds themselves with a hand-picked group of beneficiaries or supporters, using multiple pens to make the signature, which are then handed out as souvenirs. This transforms a bureaucratic act into a dramatic photo opportunity, a visual record of the leader delivering on a promise and exercising their authority in a tangible, gift-giving way. And this language of power is not confined to the political sphere. It has been eagerly adopted by the modern temples of commerce, our major corporations. A charismatic CEO today often plays a role strikingly similar to a priest-king. They don't just manage operations, they are the chief visionaries and cultural leaders. Their keynote speeches at product launches are carefully crafted performances, delivered on stages worthy of a rock concert, designed to inspire devotion to the company's mission. Think of the late Steve Jobs, whose black turtleneck and blue jeans became a uniform of visionary authority, and whose annual presentations were awaited with the fervor of a religious revelation. Company-wide meetings, off-site retreats, and internal propaganda all work to create a culture of loyalty and shared identity among employees, framing their work not just as a job but as a calling. The CEO becomes the face of the corporate brand, the ultimate source of authority and inspiration, using rituals to build a cohesive tribe out of a dispersed workforce, ensuring that everyone is pulling in the same direction, united by a shared story and a common goal. So, what are we to make of all this? Recognizing the ancient DNA within our modern political and corporate theater is not about becoming cynical. It is about becoming more conscious, more critical consumers of the power structures that shape our lives. These rituals are not inherently deceitful. They are a response to a deep and abiding human psychology. We are storytelling creatures who crave order, meaning, and a sense of belonging. We are drawn to charismatic figures who can articulate a compelling vision and make us feel part of something larger than ourselves. The rituals of power, from the anointing of a pharaoh to the inauguration of a president, are all designed to meet these fundamental needs. They provide the symbolism that makes abstract authority feel real, the ceremony that marks important transitions, and the shared experience that forges a collective identity. Understanding this deep history allows us to look past the surface of the pageantry and ask more insightful questions. We can appreciate the necessary function of these rituals in creating social cohesion, while also remaining alert to how they can be used to manufacture consent, obscure failure, or concentrate power in ways that demand our scrutiny. This journey from the temple to the throne room, and now to the podium and the boardroom, reveals a continuous thread in the human experiment, our perpetual effort to clothe the naked exercise of power in the resonant and enduring garments of ritual and story. From the sacred anointing oils that transformed a mortal into a vessel of the divine, to the carefully managed triumphs that turned military victory into a public sacrament, we have journeyed through the intricate rituals that enabled the extraordinary leap from priest to king. We have seen how the fabrication of celestial genealogies rewrote a ruler's origin story, placing their ascent in the stars, and how the assumption of the high priesthood nationalized faith, making dissent synonymous with treason. We have decoded the symbolism embedded in monumental architecture, the psychological power of sacred oaths sworn to a living emperor, and the brilliant, coercive flexibility of religious syncretism. These were not isolated acts of superstition or pageantry. They were interconnected components of a sophisticated psychological and sociological toolkit. This toolkit was designed to solve one of humanity's most enduring challenges: how to build legitimacy, manufacture consent, and forge stable, large-scale governments from a mosaic of diverse and often reluctant populations. The genius of this system was its ability to transform the raw, unsettling reality of power, which is often simply brute force, into a compelling, immersive story of divine order. It was a narrative in which every citizen, from the highest noble to the lowliest farmer, was assigned a role and given a stake, making obedience feel less like submission and less like a sacred duty and a privilege. While the age of god-kings has passed and the divine right of rulers has faded from our political constitutions, the underlying principles of this ancient playbook have not been discarded. They have simply been translated into a modern vernacular. The next time you witness the solemn pageantry of a presidential inauguration, observe the echoes of the coronation ritual. The oath sworn on a religious text recalls the sacred vows that bound a king to a higher law. The inaugural address is the modern counterpart to the promulgation of a new divine decree, setting the tone for a new era. The parade that follows is a direct descendant of the Roman triumph, a choreographed spectacle designed to showcase the strength and benevolence of the new regime and to foster a sense of shared celebration and national unity. These are not arbitrary traditions. They are the evolved forms of ancient rites, repurposed for a secular age but serving the same fundamental purpose: to mark a transfer of power with legitimacy, ceremony, and collective buy-in. Look closer at the world around you, and you will see these echoes everywhere. A national holiday like the 4th of July or Bastille Day is not just a day off work. It is a ritual of remembrance and identity, not unlike the imperial festivals that celebrated the emperor's birthday or the foundation of Rome, binding the populace together through a shared story of origin and struggle. The carefully crafted narrative of a corporate branding campaign, where a CEO is presented as a visionary leader and the company's mission is framed as a world-changing crusade, draws directly from the same well of symbolic authority that ancient rulers used. The company logo becomes the modern standard, the corporate headquarters a new form of sacred space, and the annual shareholder meeting a ritual of renewal and reaffirmation of faith in the leadership. Even the way a political leader uses a televised address to speak intimately to the nation, creating a sense of personal connection across a vast distance, is a masterful use of modern media to achieve the same feeling of staged accessibility that an emperor cultivated through controlled court audiences. Our journey through millennia to uncover these blueprints of power has provided us with more than just a fascinating history lesson. It has granted us a powerful new lens through which to view the structures of authority in our own time. This lens allows us to appreciate the necessary role that ceremony and symbol play in creating social cohesion and a sense of shared purpose. Human beings are storytelling creatures, and we crave the order and meaning that these rituals provide. Yet, this same lens also empowers us to be more discerning, to recognize when these tools are being used not to unite and inspire, but to manipulate and obscure. When we understand that a grand spectacle is a tool for manufacturing consent, we can look past the glitter and ask more critical questions about the substance behind the show. When we see how narratives are constructed to legitimize authority, we can better identify spin and challenge the official story. This knowledge is a form of intellectual self-defense, allowing us to participate in our modern rituals not as passive subjects, but as conscious, engaged citizens. Thank you for embarking on this deep exploration of history's greatest enigmas with us. We have traveled from the inner sanctums of Egyptian temples to the bustling forums of Rome, from the bloodletting rites of Maya kings to the cosmic ceremonies of Chinese emperors, all to decode the secret scripts of authority. If this journey into the distant past has cast a revealing light on the power structures of your present, if it has given you a new way to see the world, then we have achieved our goal. The story of how we are governed is the oldest story ever told, and it is still being written today. Your curiosity is the key to understanding it.